The black floodwaters swirled and churned, rising with terrifying speed. Rain fell in sheets, turning the usually placid Kansas Creek into a roaring monster that devoured everything in its path. From the doorway of their small farmhouse, Ruth Morgan watched in horror as the water breached the fence line. "Thomas!" she screamed over the howling wind. Her husband had gone to secure the barn, but the water was rising too fast. "Take the high trail!" Thomas's voice came back barely audible above the storm. She saw him then struggling against the current that already reached his knees, trying to make his way back to the house. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, the rain instantly soaking her dress. "Thomas, come back." She watched frozen in terror as he slipped. The current, stronger than it looked, pulled at him. In an instant, he was down the water, dragging him toward the fence, where debris had collected in a dangerous tangle. Ruth didn't remember moving. One moment she stood on the porch, the next she was in the water, its icy grip stealing her breath. The cold shocked her system, but she pushed forward, eyes fixed on Thomas as he fought against the current. "Hold on," she called, stretching her fingers toward him. The water pushed against her skirts, trying to sweep her feet from under her. For a moment, her fingertips brushed his coat, felt the rough wool against her skin. Then the current surged, and he was torn away. "Ruth!" His voice, desperate and fading, was the last thing she heard before the water took her too. The cold was absolute. It consumed her, filled her lungs, turned her limbs to lead. As darkness closed in, Ruth thought she felt strong hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her from the depths. Then, nothing. Kansas, 1889. 1 month after the flood. Central Market Square bustled with activity, though not with the vigor it had known before the waters came. Mud still clung to the undersides of wagon wheels. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet hay and rotting grass. Vendors had laid out what little goods they could salvage after the storm. Bruised apples, damp sacks of grain, and second-hand boots drying in the weak spring sun. Through the crowd rattled a wagon with one broken wheel. The man driving it barely slowed before jerking the reins to stop in the center of the square. In the back sat a thin woman, her hair matted from days without a comb, her body folded into a crude wheelchair with wooden planks and mismatched iron wheels. Her hands clutched a cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap, a water-damaged family Bible, its edges warped and pages swollen, but clearly treasured. Wesley Hodge, a rail-thin man with sour eyes, stood in the wagon bed and cleared his throat. "Hear me, good people," he called out, his voice sharp enough to slice through the market chatter. "This one here cannot walk, cannot bear children, eats more than she earns." He gestured dismissively at the woman. "Anyone wants her, take her. If not, she stays here for the dogs." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter and murmurs ran through the gathering crowd. Ruth Morgan kept her back straight, her eyes dry. No tears, no pleading. She looked at them the way a rescuer might look down into floodwaters, knowing some would drown and some would fight. In the weeks since the flood had taken Thomas and the use of her legs, she had learned that dignity was sometimes the only possession that couldn't be washed away. "She looks like a broken doll," someone muttered from the crowd. An old milk seller, Martha Simmons, shook her head. "Poor thing," she said quietly to the woman beside her. "Pity's one thing, feeding's another." "Who'd take her in?" From the edge of the gathering, a tall man in a worn brown coat and hat watched in silence. Nathaniel Hayes didn't move until Hodge turned away to spit a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Then he stepped forward, boots splashing in shallow puddles as he approached the wagon. Without a word, he took hold of the wheelchair's handles. "She's not garbage," he said, voice low, but carrying across the suddenly quiet market. "I'll take her to my ranch." Hodge turned scowling. "She's my family's property. I didn't say you could." "She's breathing," Nathaniel cut in. "That makes her a person." Hodge's lip curled. "You think you can just—" "I can, and I will." Nathaniel's voice was steady, his weathered face impassive beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Hodge hopped down from the wagon bed, squaring his shoulders as he faced Nathaniel. Though tall himself, he still had to look up at the rancher. "She's under my roof. She eats my bread. You want her, you pay." "You're not selling a mule," Nathaniel said, "and I'm not buying a life." "Then she's not yours to take." Nathaniel straightened to his full height, releasing the wheelchair long enough to turn and face the crowd. His words came like a gunshot in the tense silence. "If anyone here thinks a human life is worth less than a horse, try and stop me. I'll take her home." The crowd stilled. A few men shifted uneasily. Martha Simmons looked down at her hands, shame coloring her cheeks. No one stepped forward. Nathaniel gripped the wheelchair again, angling it toward the edge of the square. Hodge muttered a curse, but did not follow as Nathaniel carefully lifted the chair down from the wagon and began pushing it away from the market. The road stretched before them, rutted and still damp from recent rains. As they left the last buildings of town behind, Ruth's hands tightened on the Bible in her lap. Her voice, soft but clear, reached Nathaniel's ears. "Do you do this for attention?" Nathaniel didn't look down at her. "I don't need attention," he said. "I need to see you live." They continued in silence, the sound of the wagon wheels fading behind them, replaced by the steady crunch of Nathaniel's boots and the faint creak of the wheelchair's axles. The road to Nathaniel's ranch stretched long and empty, the horizon broken only by the sway of tall prairie grass, and the occasional bent tree still showing the marks of the flood's passage. By the time they reached the weathered gate marked with a simple Hayes Ranch sign, the sun was leaning low, painting the land in gold and dust. Nathaniel wheeled Ruth across the packed dirt yard and up to a small but solid house. Unlike many buildings they had passed, it showed few signs of flood damage. Built on a slight rise, it had apparently escaped the worst of the waters. He opened the door to a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of cedar and soap. At the far end waited a small room tidy with a single bed, neatly made a wooden chest at its foot, and a narrow window that looked out toward the wheat fields. A folded quilt rested at the edge of the mattress. It was clear the space had been prepared, though Ruth could not imagine why. The sheets were fresh, the floor swept. Even the oil lamp on the bedside table was full and trimmed, ready to be lit. She looked from the bed to Nathaniel. "You had this ready." "I had a room," he said simply, parking her chair just inside. "Now it is yours." Ruth gripped the wheels and moved herself farther in her eyes, never leaving him. "I can manage." Nathaniel nodded. "I know." He stepped back to the doorway. "Supper in an hour. Call if you need anything." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall. Ruth sat alone in the unfamiliar room, the Bible still clutched in her lap. Slowly, her fingers loosened their grip on the damp cloth covering. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the water-damaged book beneath. The Morgan family Bible had been a wedding gift. Its leather cover now warped, its pages swollen and stuck together in places. She opened it gently to where a sodden ribbon marked the Psalms. The words were blurred in places, but still legible. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Ruth closed the book, unable to read further. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet room, "why did you save me and not him?" No answer came, but the distant sound of Nathaniel moving about the kitchen and the soft whisper of wind through the prairie grass outside. That first evening, she tried to do everything herself, awkwardly transferring from chair to bed, arranging her meager belongings on the chest, washing her face in the basin Nathaniel had left. Every movement cost her effort, but she refused to call for help. When dinner time came, Nathaniel did not enter. Instead, he set a tray outside the door, a bowl of stew, a thick slice of bread, a jar of fresh water. "Food's here." His voice came through the wood, calm and unhurried. Only after she called back acknowledgement did his footsteps retreat. Ruth opened the door and pulled the tray onto her lap. The stew was simple but well-made, the bread fresh. She ate slowly, watching the last light fade from the window, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought her to this quiet room in a stranger's house. When she finished, she set the tray back outside the door. Tiredness washed over her, the kind that came from weeks of grief and fear, rather than just the day's journey. She managed to change into her nightgown, the only other clothing she possessed, besides the dress she'd worn that day. As she settled into the bed, its softness felt almost foreign after the hard pallet she'd been given at the Hodge farm. Ruth extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. The creak of the house settling the distant lowing of cattle, the endless whisper of prairie wind. She expected tears to come, as they often did in the night's quiet hours, but her eyes remained dry. Perhaps she had no tears left, or perhaps this strange day had left her too numb for weeping. Eventually, sleep claimed her deep and dreamless for the first time since the flood. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the small window and the smell of coffee drifting under the door. Ruth woke disoriented, taking a moment to remember where she was. The sound of movement in the kitchen reminded her. The tall rancher Nathaniel Hayes had taken her from the market. She pushed herself up, reaching for her chair. As she did, she noticed something new on her pillow, a soft piece of folded linen. She reached for it and found a handkerchief, old but clean edges embroidered with faded thread. The single letter M was stitched in one corner, careful and elegant. Ruth stared at it for a long while before tucking it into her dress pocket. She washed and dressed as best she could, then wheeled herself toward the kitchen following the scent of coffee and bacon. Nathaniel stood at the stove, his back to her. He wore a simple cotton shirt, suspenders, and worn trousers. Without his hat, she could see his hair was dark brown with threads of silver at the temples. "Good morning," she said quietly. He turned, nodding once. "Morning, Miss Ruth." He spoke her name with a formality that seemed at odds with the circumstances, as though she were a lady in Sunday silk, rather than a destitute widow in a borrowed wheelchair. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing to a pot on the table, "and breakfast soon." Ruth wheeled herself to the table, noticing it had been set for two. She poured coffee into a mug with hands that trembled slightly, whether from weakness or nerves she couldn't tell. "Thank you for the handkerchief," she said, after taking a sip of the strong, bitter coffee. Nathaniel set a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "It was my mother's," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Why give it to me?" Finally, he set the pan aside and met her gaze. "Because I think maybe no one's ever asked you how you want to live." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "And you think this asks?" "It says you have something of your own here," Nathaniel replied, "even if it is just a piece of cloth." Ruth did not answer. She turned her attention to the food, though her appetite had fled. Nathaniel sat across from her with his own plate, eating methodically, not filling the silence with needless words. The quiet between them felt strange, but not uncomfortable. When they finished eating, he took the dishes to the wash basin. "I need to check the cattle," he said. "Feel free to explore. The house isn't large." After he left, Ruth did explore, pushing her chair through the small, neat rooms. The house was simple but well kept. A kitchen, a sitting room with worn but clean furniture, Nathaniel's bedroom. She only glanced in, noting the Spartan furnishings, and her own room. A narrow porch wrapped around the back of the house, overlooking fields that stretched to the horizon. On a small desk in the sitting room, she noticed several sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting, addressed but apparently never sent. She didn't read them, respecting the privacy of personal correspondence, but she wondered who Nathaniel Hayes wrote to, but never mailed. By midday, she had ventured onto the back porch, the wheels of her chair settling neatly between the planks. The spring sun felt good on her face after so many weeks spent indoors at the Hodge farm. In the distance, she could see Nathaniel walking the fence line, methodically checking for damage. He worked steadily, moving with the measured pace of a man accustomed to long days of physical labor. There was something reassuring in his methodical approach, a sense of order in a world that had felt chaotic since the floodwaters came. Ruth unconsciously touched the Bible in her lap, tracing the damaged spine with her fingertips. In the month since the flood, she had clung to it like a lifeline, even as her faith wavered. How could a loving God have taken Thomas, but spared her, only to leave her broken and dependent on the charity of others? The question had haunted her sleepless nights. As the afternoon wore on, Nathaniel returned to the barn, emerging later, leading a speckled mare. He walked the horse to the porch where Ruth sat. "This is Pepper," he said, patting the mare's neck. "Gentlest horse on the place." Ruth looked at the horse with a mixture of longing and fear. Before the flood, she had ridden, often enjoying the freedom it brought. Now, with legs that wouldn't obey her commands, that freedom seemed forever lost. "She's beautiful," Ruth said softly. Nathaniel nodded. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to feed the hens without letting them peck your fingers." He said it matter-of-factly, as though it were already decided that Ruth would be staying, would be participating in the life of the ranch. She opened her mouth to protest, to remind him that she was broken, useless, a burden, all the things Hodge had told her daily since the flood. But something in Nathaniel's steady gaze stopped her. He wasn't offering charity or pity. He was offering purpose. "All right," she said instead. That evening followed the same pattern as the first. Nathaniel brought food to her door, announced its presence, and left her to eat in privacy. After she returned the tray to the hallway, Ruth heard him moving about the house, the occasional creak of floorboards marking his passage. Later, as she lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the prairie, she heard his door open and close, followed by the soft thud of boots on the porch. Curious, she pushed herself up and wheeled to the window. In the silver wash of moonlight, she could see Nathaniel sitting on the porch steps, his posture suggesting a man carrying a heavy burden. He sat motionless for a long time, staring out at the dark fields before finally returning inside. Ruth settled back into bed, wondering what ghosts haunted the man who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, brought her into his home. She fell asleep with the handkerchief clutched in her palm, the embroidered M a small comfort in the darkness. The days began to find a rhythm. Each morning, Nathaniel would have coffee ready when Ruth emerged from her room. They would eat breakfast together in comfortable silence. Then he would tell her his plans for the day. Never once did he speak to her with pity or treat her as an invalid. True to his word, he showed her how to feed the hens, placing a shallow wooden box across her lap so she could carry eggs from the coop without spilling them. He taught her which plants in his small kitchen garden needed watering, positioning her chair so she could reach them easily. "You ever plant before?" he asked one afternoon, kneeling in a garden row. "Not since I was a girl," she said. "Well, it's the same as then," he replied. "Only now you do it sitting down." He dug a hole, pressed a seed into her palm. She lowered it into the earth, covered it, patted it down. The dirt was cool against her skin. For a moment, she felt as though something else, something unseen, had been planted too. By the third week, her hands had grown more sure with the soil. She did not notice at first that Nathaniel had started leaving his work close to the porch whenever she was outside. He never said it was, so she could talk to him, but the quiet between them had begun to fill with small, steady words. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Ruth wheeled herself to the sitting room where Nathaniel sat reading by lamplight. The Bible she had carried from the flood rested on her lap. "I've been meaning to ask," she said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "How did you know my name? At the market you called me Ruth, but Hodge never said it." Nathaniel looked up from his book, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He closed the volume slowly, marking his place with a faded ribbon. "I knew your husband," he said finally. Ruth's hands tightened on the Bible. "Thomas? How?" Nathaniel set his book aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We served together in the war. I was a field surgeon with the 8th Kansas. Thomas was our mail carrier." Ruth stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with what she knew of her husband. Thomas had rarely spoken of his war years. "He never mentioned you." "Some men don't like to remember those days," Nathaniel said. "Can't say I blame them." Ruth looked down at the Bible in her lap, then back at Nathaniel. "This Bible," she said slowly, "it was a wedding gift. From a friend of Thomas's who couldn't attend." She opened the front cover where an inscription was still visible despite the water damage. "To Thomas and Ruth Morgan. May your home be blessed with love and light. Your friend N.H. You," she whispered, "you gave us this." Nathaniel nodded once. "I did." "But why?" She struggled to formulate the question. "Why didn't you say anything when you took me from the market?" Nathaniel's gaze was steady. "Would it have mattered? You needed help, not explanations. And the room, you had it ready. How did you know I would be there that day?" A shadow crossed his face. "I didn't. Not exactly." He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening fields. "After the flood, I heard about Thomas. I'm sorry, Ruth. He was a good man." "Yes," she said softly. "He was. I also heard his uncle had taken in his widow. I know Wesley Hodge. Knew he wouldn't be kind." Nathaniel's voice hardened slightly. "I've had that room ready since I heard. Thought I might need to offer it someday." Ruth absorbed this information slowly. "So when you saw me at the market—" "I kept my promise," Nathaniel said simply. "What promise?" He turned back to face her, his expression grave. "Last time I saw Thomas before I left the army, he made me promise something. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should look after you." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He called you his prairie flower. Said you were stronger than anyone knew." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in weeks. The thought of Thomas saying those words, believing in her strength, even then, broke something loose inside her. "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "Not anymore." Nathaniel crossed the room and knelt before her wheelchair, his movements careful, deliberate. "Strength isn't always in what we do," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's in what we survive." Ruth looked into his face, seeing for the first time the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the weight of his own burdens. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand, where it rested on the arm of her chair. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping your promise." He nodded once, then rose and moved back to his chair. They sat in silence, As darkness claimed the prairie, each lost in memories of the man who had connected their lives. Later that night, after Nathaniel had said goodnight and retreated to his room, Ruth lay awake, her mind spinning with the day's revelations. The Bible rested on the bedside table, its presence both comfort and question. She thought of Thomas, of the parts of his life he had kept separate, of the friendship with this quiet rancher he had never mentioned. And she wondered what other promises Nathaniel Hayes might be keeping. The next morning, Ruth woke to find Nathaniel already gone from the house, his coffee cup washed and put away. She made her own breakfast, finding a strange satisfaction in the simple task. As she ate, she noticed something different about the Bible where she had left it on the table. A small piece of paper protruded from between the pages. She opened it carefully to find that Nathaniel had inserted a thin sheet of tissue paper between some of the stuck pages, gently beginning the process of separating them. The gesture touched her deeply, a small act of preservation of care for something she valued. When she went to return the Bible to her room, she paused at Nathaniel's partially open door. She had respected his privacy until now, but curiosity about this man who had known her husband, who had taken her in without explanation, overcame her usual restraint. His room was spare, almost austere. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small desk by the window. On the desk lay several sheets of paper, the same ones she had glimpsed earlier. This time close enough to see she realized they were letters. Each began the same way, "Dear Thomas." Ruth's breath caught. Letters to her dead husband written after his death. She shouldn't read them, knew it was an invasion of privacy, and yet she picked up the top letter dated just 2 weeks earlier. "Dear Thomas, I found her today. Ruth was exactly as you described, dignity intact even when all else is lost. Hodge had her in the market like livestock. I've brought her home as I promised I would. She doesn't know who I am yet. I haven't told her about our friendship or about that day by the river. I don't know if I ever will. Some truths are too heavy to bear, and she carries enough already." Your friend, Nathaniel Ruth, set the letter down with trembling hands. What day by the river? What truth was too heavy to bear? Before she could consider further, she heard footsteps on the porch. Quickly, she wheeled herself back to the kitchen, her heart pounding. Nathaniel entered, hat in hand, boots muddy from the fields. He nodded a greeting. "Morning got away from me," he said. "Fence broke in the north pasture." Ruth managed a smile, hoping her guilt at snooping didn't show on her face. "There's still coffee," she offered. As he poured himself a cup, Ruth gathered her courage. "Nathaniel," she began, "there's something I need to ask you." He turned cup in hand, his expression open but guarded. "What is it?" "You said you knew Thomas in the war, but the war ended many years ago. Did you keep in touch all this time?" Nathaniel took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Not directly. I'd hear about him now and then. Kansas isn't so big that news doesn't travel. And yet, you never visited, never introduced yourself as his old friend." A shadow crossed his face. "I meant to, many times, but—" He set the cup down. "After the war, I wasn't fit company for decent folk. Took me years to put myself back together." Ruth studied him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "And by the time you were ready, by then it seemed too late. Too much time had passed." He met her gaze directly. "I'm not good with people, Ruth. Never have been. It's why I live out here, keep to myself." She nodded slowly, accepting his explanation, though she sensed it wasn't the whole truth. "Will you tell me about him? About Thomas during the war? He rarely spoke of those years." Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. "He was brave, not in the way some men are, loud and showy. Quiet, brave. Would ride through enemy territory to deliver mail, knowing what it meant to the men to get word from home. He looked out the window into the past. Saved my life once. After Chickamauga. Field hospital was overrun. He got me out, half carried me to safety. Ruth felt tears well in her eyes. This was a Thomas. She hadn't known a man who had lived a life before he became her husband. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me." Nathaniel nodded once, then changed the subject. "I'm building something in the barn. Might be useful to you. Should be ready tomorrow." That night, Ruth returned to Nathaniel's room when he was outside doing evening chores. She knew she shouldn't, but the mystery of the unfinished conversation of the day by the river mentioned in the letter drove her to search for answers. She found another letter, this one older, dated just after the flood. "Dear Thomas, I heard today about the flood, about what happened to you. I should have been there. Maybe I could have done something, used what I learned as a surgeon to save you. Instead, I was miles away, useless when my friend needed me most. They say Ruth survived, but is badly injured. I think of her alone in the care of your uncle, and it fills me with dread." Wesley Hodge was cruel, even as a young man. Age will not have improved him. "I keep thinking of that day by the river, of the promise I made. I will keep it, Thomas. Whatever it takes, I will keep her safe." Your friend Nathaniel Ruth replaced the letter, more confused than before. The promise seemed to be about protecting her. But what had happened by the river? What was Nathaniel not telling her? She was still pondering this question the next morning when Nathaniel led her to the barn after breakfast. Inside, he had built a strange contraption, a frame of polished pine and iron bolts that seemed designed to attach to a saddle. "What is it?" she asked, studying the craftsmanship. "A way for you to ride again," Nathaniel said simply. He led Pepper, the speckled mare, into the barn. The horse was already saddled, and Ruth could see how the wooden frame would lock into the stirrups and cinch. "It will keep you steady without your legs holding you," Nathaniel explained. "Thought you might want to ride again." Ruth's fingers tightened on the arms of her chair. "I have not ridden since—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Nathaniel said, "but if you want to try, this will keep you in the saddle." Ruth stared at the frame, the smell of leather and horse sweat rising in the breeze. The thought of being on horseback again, of feeling that freedom, made her heart race with both fear and longing. "If I fall, then you fall," Nathaniel said simply, "and get back up." She drew in a breath. "I will do it." He helped her transfer from the chair to a mounting block, then into the strange frame. It held her snug, her hips level, her torso upright. Pepper shifted once beneath her, patient and warm. Nathaniel stepped back. "Take the reins." Ruth gripped them, the familiar feel of leather straps in her hands, bringing back memories of countless rides before the flood. The first few steps were jerky, Pepper uncertain of her new burden. Nathaniel walked alongside, saying nothing. He let her feel the motion, the sway, the pull in her arms. By the third circuit of the yard, Ruth was smiling, a genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time since Nathaniel had brought her to the ranch. The sense of movement, of control, filled a void she hadn't realized was there. Then Pepper stumbled on a rut. The frame tilted, and Ruth pitched sideways. She hit the ground, hard dust kicking up around her. Pain shot through her palms where they scraped the earth. Nathaniel stood a pace away, watching. Ruth pushed up on her elbows, her breath sharp. "Are you going to just stand there? You need my hand." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality, then shook her head. "Not yet." It took 3 tries, but she got herself upright, dragging her chair close enough to climb in. Her arms shook, her skirt torn at the hem, but she looked at Pepper and said, "Again." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in assessment. All right. The second fall came half an hour later when Ruth tried to turn Pepper too sharply. This time her elbow took the brunt, the skin raw against the dirt. Again, Nathaniel waited silent until she asked, "Help me, please." He was there in an instant, lifting her with care. "That is enough for today." "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "One more." They went again and again until the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew long. When Ruth finally agreed to stop, she was streaked with dust and sweat, her hair loose from its braid. But her eyes held something new, something fierce and alive. That night after supper, Ruth sat by the window mending the small tears in her apron. She noticed Nathaniel at the table, a spool of dark thread in his hand, her riding skirt folded in his lap. He was sewing the torn seam, his stitches slow but careful. "You can sew," she said, surprised. "My mother taught me," Nathaniel replied without looking up. Said, "A man who can fix his own clothes will never go begging." She watched him for a long moment. "You did not have to do that." "I know." When he finished, he smoothed the fabric once and set it aside. Their eyes met across the lamplight. There was no pity in his gaze, no trace of the guarded sympathy she had grown used to seeing in others' eyes. What she saw there was quieter, heavier. Respect. Nathaniel stood collecting the mended skirt. "Tomorrow we will try the south pasture, smoother ground." Ruth nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "All right." As he left the room, she touched the clean stitches, feeling the strength of the thread. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh earth and horse sweat. And for the first time since the flood, Ruth felt as though she was not learning to be less, but learning to be more. The morning dawned clear and cool, promising a perfect day for riding. Ruth woke with a strange lightness in her heart, an anticipation she hadn't felt in months. She dressed quickly, choosing her newly mended riding skirt, and wheeled herself to the kitchen. To her surprise, the house was empty. A pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, but Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. Through the window she could make out his tall figure in the distance, standing by the fence line, talking to someone on horseback. As she watched, the visitor handed Nathaniel something, papers it seemed, before riding away. Nathaniel stood motionless for a long moment, then turned back toward the house, his stride purposeful. Ruth poured herself coffee and waited, curiosity mingling with a strange unease. When Nathaniel entered, his expression was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He placed the papers on the table between them. These came from town. Legal papers. He met her gaze directly. "Hodge is claiming you as his ward. Says you're not of sound mind to manage your own affairs after the accident." Ruth's hands tightened around her mug. "That's absurd. I'm perfectly sound of mind." "You and I know that." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. "But the law might see differently. A widow with no means of support, no use of her legs." "Why would he do this?" Ruth asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew the answer. Wesley Hodge had never shown concern for her welfare before. Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Thomas left you land. Good land by Willow Creek. Hodge wants it." Ruth stared at him. Land? Thomas never mentioned owning land by Willow Creek. "He bought it just before," Nathaniel hesitated. "Just before the flood. Hadn't told you yet, I gather." He sat heavily in the chair across from her. "If Hodge becomes your guardian, he'll control that land. Can sell it, keep the money." Ruth felt cold despite the warm coffee in her hands. "He can't do this. I won't let him." "We won't let him," Nathaniel corrected. He tapped the papers. Judge Harper will hear the case next week. We have until then to prepare. Ruth looked down at the legal documents, the formal language swimming before her eyes. What can we do? He'll say I'm an invalid, dependent on charity. Her voice bitter, she added, and he wouldn't be wrong. Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze intense. Listen to me, Ruth. You are not an invalid. You're a woman who survived what would have killed most. You're learning to ride again, to garden, to make a life. His voice softened. Thomas knew your strength. It's why he loved you. Ruth felt tears threaten and blinked them back. Even if that's true, how do we convince a Judge Hodge has influence in town? People respect him, or at least fear him. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering. We show the judge who you really are. Not Hodge's broken doll, but Ruth Morgan, a woman rebuilding her life after tragedy. The writing lesson was postponed. Instead, they spent the morning planning their defense. Nathaniel knew Judge Harper, a fair man if a bit traditional, he said, and believed that if they could demonstrate Ruth's independence, the judge would rule in her favor. We need witnesses, Nathaniel said, people who've seen you managing despite your injury. Ruth laughed without humor. You're the only person I've seen in weeks. Nathaniel considered this. Then we'll have to change that. Tomorrow is Sunday. We'll go to town for church. The idea filled Ruth with dread. I can't. Everyone will stare. They'll whisper. Let them, Nathaniel said firmly. Let them see you with your head high. It's the first step to changing their minds. That night, Ruth slept poorly, her dreams filled with faceless crowds pointing and laughing as she struggled to wheel herself through mud. She woke early, a knot of anxiety tight in her chest. When she emerged from her room, she found Nathaniel already dressed in his Sunday best, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a string tie. He'd trimmed his beard and combed his hair, looking more like a respectable rancher than the solitary figure who'd rescued her from the market. I laid out my mother's dress, he said, if you'd like to wear it. About your size, I think. In her room, Ruth found a simple blue dress modestly cut, but made of good quality cotton. It was old-fashioned but well-preserved, speaking of a woman who valued quality and care. Ruth touched it gently, honored by the offering. With effort, she changed into the dress, surprised to find it fit well. She braided her hair neatly and pinned it, then examined herself in the small mirror on the wall. The woman who looked back was thin, her face bearing the marks of grief and hardship, but not beaten. Not yet. Nathaniel had hitched the wagon, adapting the seat with cushions to support her back. He helped her up, without comment, treating the assistance as practical rather than pitying. As they set off toward town, Ruth clutched her Bible in her lap, drawing courage from its familiar weight. The church sat on a slight rise at the edge of town, its white steeple visible for miles across the prairie. As Nathaniel pulled the wagon into the churchyard, Ruth felt the weight of eyes turning toward them. Conversations paused, heads turned. Ready? Nathaniel asked quietly. Ruth nodded, though her heart hammered in her chest. With deliberate movements, Nathaniel came around to her side, lifted her down, and settled her in the wheelchair he'd brought in the wagon bed. Then he stepped behind her and began pushing the chair toward the church steps. They made an unusual picture, the tall, reserved rancher and the woman in the wheelchair. Ruth felt the stairs like physical touches, but kept her gaze forward, her back straight. At the bottom of the steps, they faced their first challenge. The church entrance was raised with no easy way for the wheelchair to access it. Before Ruth could suggest Nathaniel leave her outside, a voice called out, "Mr. Hayes, wait a moment." Pastor Jonathan Porter hurried down the steps, his kind face creased with concern. "I see we have a problem. Let me help." He turned and called to two strong young men from the congregation. Together with Nathaniel, they lifted Ruth's chair up the steps, handling the task with respectful care. "Thank you, Pastor," Ruth said once they were inside. "Mrs. Morgan, isn't it?" he asked. "I heard you were staying at the Hayes Ranch. I'm glad to see you well enough to join us today." His genuine welcome eased some of the tension in Ruth's shoulders. Nathaniel wheeled her to a space in the back where the chair would not block the aisle, then took a seat beside her. Ruth was conscious of the whispers, the sideways glances, but the familiar rhythm of the service soon drew her attention away from the congregation's curiosity. When the first hymn began, Ruth sang softly, her voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with each verse. The words of Amazing Grace took on new meaning as she sat in that simple country church, a survivor of her own dark waters. After the service, many parishioners kept their distance, unsure how to approach the woman in the wheelchair. But Pastor Porter made a point of introducing Ruth to several members of the congregation, treating her as he would any newcomer to his flock. Among those who came forward was Martha Simmons, the milk seller, who had commented on Ruth's plight in the market. The older woman's face was pinched with what looked like guilt. "Mrs. Morgan," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up that day at the market. It wasn't right what Hodge did." Ruth was surprised by the apology, but touched by its sincerity. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons." "Martha, please." The older woman glanced at Nathaniel, who stood a respectful distance away, talking with the pastor. "Mr. Hayes is a good man, keeps to himself mostly, but always fair in his dealings." She lowered her voice. "Is he treating you well?" "Very well," Ruth assured her. "He's been kind." Martha nodded, satisfied. "Good. If you need anything, woman things you know, you send word. My place is just past the mill." By the time they left the church, Ruth had spoken with several members of the community, including the blacksmith's wife, who promised to visit with some preserved fruits, and an elderly man who introduced himself as Ezekiel Taylor. "Served with Hayes in the war," he told Ruth, his rheumy eyes crinkling at the corners. "He was the best surgeon in the regiment. Saved my leg when others would have taken it off." He tapped his cane against his left boot. "Still works, thanks to him." Ruth looked at Nathaniel with new understanding. A surgeon. It explained his steady hands, his careful movements, his knowledge of how to help her adjust to her disability. On the drive home, Ruth was quiet, processing the morning's events. Nathaniel respected her silence, focusing on guiding the team through the rutted road. Finally, as they turned onto the lane leading to the ranch, Ruth spoke. "You were a doctor." "A surgeon." Nathaniel's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Once." "Why did you stop? Ezekiel said you were the best." For a long moment, Ruth thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice low against the creaking of the wagon wheels, he said, "I couldn't save enough of them." The simple statement held volumes of pain. Ruth understood then why he lived alone, why he kept to himself. Some wounds never fully healed. "Thank you," she said softly, "for today, for everything." Nathaniel nodded once, his profile strong against the afternoon sky. "You did well. Showed them who you really are." Ruth wasn't sure who exactly she was anymore. Not the carefree young wife she'd been before the flood, nor the broken doll Hodge had tried to discard. But perhaps with time and Nathaniel's quiet support, she might discover a new Ruth Morgan, one strong enough to face whatever came next. As they neared the house, Nathaniel slowed the wagon. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice grave. "Something about the day of the flood." Ruth tensed, sensing they had reached the heart of the mystery she'd glimpsed in his letters. "What about it?" Nathaniel took a deep breath. I was there, Ruth. Not at your home, but downstream. I was fishing when the waters rose. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I saw Thomas in the current. Tried to reach him, but the water was too strong, too fast. Ruth's heart pounded. And me, did you see me too? A muscle worked in Nathaniel's jaw. I pulled you from the river. You were unconscious, barely breathing. I got you to shore, started your breathing again. His voice grew rougher. Then riders came. Hodge and his men, searching after the waters, began to recede. I should have stayed, should have made sure you were properly cared for. But he trailed off. You what? Ruth whispered. I was a coward, Nathaniel said flatly. I let them take you, told myself they were family, would care for you better than a stranger could. His knuckles were white on the reins. When I heard how Hodge was treating you, I knew I'd failed Thomas. Failed you both. Ruth sat in stunned silence, absorbing this revelation. Nathaniel had been there on the worst day of her life. Had tried to save Thomas. Had saved her. Why didn't you tell me? She asked finally. I didn't want your gratitude, he said. Didn't deserve it. A braver man would have stood his ground against Hodge, made sure you were properly tended. He glanced at her briefly. I thought it was better you didn't know. Ruth thought of the letters she'd found, of the guilt and regret that had flowed through Nathaniel's private words to her dead husband. His actions since, bringing her to his home, teaching her to be independent despite her disability, defending her against Hodge, all took on new meaning. You saved my life, she said softly, and let Thomas die. Nathaniel countered the words, harsh with self-recrimination. No, Ruth's voice was firm. The flood took Thomas. You did what you could. She reached out tentatively, touching his arm. Thank you for telling me the truth. Nathaniel nodded once, his expression still haunted. As they pulled up to the house, Ruth found herself seeing him with new eyes. Not just as her husband's friend, or her reluctant protector, but as a man carrying his own burden of grief and guilt, trying in his own way to make amends. That night, as rain pattered softly on the roof, Ruth lay awake thinking of all she had learned. Nathaniel Hayes had been woven into her life in ways she'd never imagined. As Thomas's friend, as her rescuer, as the man who now stood between her and Wesley Hodge's greed. And somehow in the midst of loss and struggle, she had found herself not just surviving, but beginning to live again under his quiet care. The days following Nathaniel's revelation passed in a strange, heightened awareness. Ruth found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The careful precision of his movements, the way his hands, surgeon's hands, moved with deliberate grace, whether mending tack or turning the pages of a book. These were the hands that had pulled her from the floodwaters, that had breathed life back into her lungs when the cold water would have claimed her. She wondered what else she didn't know about this quiet man who had inserted himself into her life with such understated determination. 3 days after their trip to church, Ruth woke to the sound of voices on the porch. Wheeling herself to the window, she saw Nathaniel speaking with Pastor Porter. Their expressions were serious, their conversation too low to hear. After several minutes, the pastor clasped Nathaniel's shoulder, then mounted his horse and rode away. When Nathaniel came inside, his face was set in grim lines. "What is it?" Ruth asked. "The hearing has been moved up. Hodge convinced Judge Harper there was urgency." Nathaniel hung his hat on the peg by the door. "It's the day after tomorrow." Ruth's stomach knotted with anxiety. "So soon? But we're not ready." "We'll have to be." Nathaniel poured himself coffee. his movements measured despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "Pastor Porter came to tell us he'll speak on your behalf. Mrs. Simmons as well." "That's something at least." Ruth tried to keep her voice steady. "But will it be enough? Hodge has influence connections." Nathaniel met her gaze directly. "We have the truth. And your strength." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else we could do. Something that would make Hodge's petition irrelevant." "What?" A faint flush crept up Nathaniel's neck, barely visible above his collar. "We could marry." Ruth stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What did you say?" "As your husband, I would automatically become your legal guardian. Hodge's petition would be moot." Nathaniel's voice was matter-of-fact, as if proposing a business arrangement rather than a life-altering union. "It would be in name only, of course. Nothing would change in our daily arrangements." Ruth found herself speechless. Of all the solutions Nathaniel might have proposed, marriage had never occurred to her. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious." He set his coffee cup down. "It's the surest way to protect you and Thomas's land." "But," Ruth struggled to articulate her objections, "we barely know each other. And She gestured helplessly at her legs. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. "Ruth, I'm not asking for a real marriage, just a legal arrangement to keep you safe from Hodge." The practical part of her recognized the logic in his proposal. As a married woman, she would have protection under the law that a widow lacked. Yet something in her rebelled at the idea of a marriage of convenience, even one born of necessity. "I need time to think," she said finally. Nathaniel nodded. "Of course, but not too much time. The hearing is day after tomorrow." He left her, then heading out to the barn to tend to the morning chores. Ruth sat alone in the kitchen, her mind whirling with this unexpected development. Marriage to Nathaniel Hayes. The very thought sent a strange flutter through her chest. Not entirely unpleasant, but unsettling nonetheless. What would Thomas think of such an arrangement? Would he understand it was merely for protection, to preserve the land he had left her? Or would he see it as a betrayal? Wedding another man so soon after his death, Ruth wheeled herself to her room and retrieved the Bible from her bedside table. She ran her fingers over the damaged cover, thinking of Nathaniel's patient efforts to restore it page by page. In just a few weeks, he had done more for her than most would do in a lifetime. Given her shelter, taught her independence, defended her against Hodge, and now offered his name as protection. And yet, there remained mysteries about him that troubled her. Why had he abandoned medicine to become a rancher? What had driven him to such isolation? And why did he feel such obligation to Thomas that he would go to these lengths to fulfill a promise? The day passed in a fog of indecision. Ruth went through her usual tasks, feeding the chickens, watering the garden, but her mind remained consumed with Nathaniel's proposal. By evening, when he returned from the fields, she still had not reached a decision. They ate supper in uncharacteristic silence, the unspoken question hanging between them like a physical presence. Finally, as Ruth prepared to retire for the night, Nathaniel spoke. "You don't have to answer tonight," he said quietly, "but we'll need to decide by morning if we're to arrange it before the hearing." Ruth nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Good night, Nathaniel." In her room, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as moonlight painted silver patterns across the walls. Marriage to Nathaniel would solve the immediate problem of Hodge's guardianship claim. It would allow her to stay at the ranch to continue rebuilding her strength and independence. It made perfect practical sense. So why did the thought fill her with such confusion? Near midnight, unable to sleep, Ruth transferred herself to her chair and wheeled quietly to the sitting room. Perhaps reading would calm her thoughts enough to allow rest. The house was silent, Nathaniel presumably asleep in his room. Ruth lit a small lamp, and placed it on the table beside Nathaniel's desk. As she searched for a book to read, her eyes fell again on the stack of letters, Nathaniel's unsent correspondence to her dead husband. She hesitated, knowing she should respect his privacy. But these letters might hold answers to the questions that plagued her, might help her decide whether to accept his extraordinary offer. With trembling fingers, she selected a letter from the middle of the stack, dated several years earlier. Dear Thomas, it has been 5 years since the war ended. 5 years of trying to forget what I saw, what I did, what I failed to do. I thought returning to medicine would help, that saving lives in peacetime might balance the scales against those I lost on the battlefield. I was wrong. Last month, I lost a young woman in childbirth. Nothing unusual in her case, nothing I should not have been able to handle. But when the bleeding wouldn't stop, I froze. For a crucial minute, I was back in that field hospital at Chickamauga, surrounded by screaming men and the smell of blood and gunpowder. By the time I recovered myself, it was too late. She died, Thomas. She died because I couldn't outrun my ghosts. I've sold my practice, bought land in western Kansas. Good grazing country, they say, far from people from their trusting eyes, and the chance I might fail them again. You would call me a coward, and perhaps you'd be right. But I cannot bear to hold another life in my hands only to watch it slip away. I think often of our conversations by the campfire, of your stories about your Ruth and the life you plan to build with her. I hope you found the peace I still seek. Your friend, Nathaniel Ruth, set the letter down her heart, aching for the tormented man who had written those words. The war had marked him deeply, left scars that drove him to isolation, rather than risk failing another patient. It explained so much about his quiet nature, his careful distance. She selected another letter, this one more recent, dated just a week after the flood. Dear Thomas, I failed you when it mattered most. I was downstream when the waters rose, saw you struggling in the current. I tried to reach you. God knows I tried, but the river was too powerful, too wild. I managed to pull Ruth from the water barely alive. For a moment, I thought I might at least save her, might not fail completely. I got her breathing again, but then Hodge and his men arrived. They said they were family, that they would care for her. I let them take her, Thomas. I let them take her because I was afraid. Afraid I would fail her as I had failed you, afraid I would do more harm than good. Now I hear she cannot walk, that Hodge treats her like an unwanted burden. I should have stood my ground, should have insisted on proper medical care for her injuries. Perhaps then she might still walk. Another failure to add to my long list. I've prepared a room for her here. When the time is right, I'll fulfill my promise to you, to watch over her if anything happened to you. It's the least I can do, though. It feels too little, too late. Your friend, Nathaniel Ruth, felt tears well in her eyes. Nathaniel blamed himself not just for failing to save Thomas, but for her paralysis as well. He believed that if he had insisted on treating her rather than allowing Hodge to take her, she might still have the use of her legs. No wonder he had devoted himself so completely to helping her adapt to teaching her independence despite her disability. It wasn't just about keeping a promise to Thomas. It was about atonement. One more letter caught her eye, the most recent, dated just the previous week. Dear Thomas, Ruth grows stronger each day. You would be proud of her determination. Yesterday, she insisted on continuing to ride after falling twice. There is steel in her that even she does not recognize yet. I find myself watching her when she doesn't notice. The graceful way she moves despite her limitations, the fierce concentration as she learns new skills, the rare smile that transforms her face when she succeeds at something difficult. I understand now why you spoke of her with such devotion. I've done my best to keep my promise to you, to keep her safe, and help her find her strength again. But I fear I am failing in one respect. I find myself caring for her in ways that go beyond obligation or friendship. This was never part of our bargain, never what you asked of me when you extracted that promise by the river. I will not act on these feelings. Ruth deserves better than a broken man with blood on his hands. And I would never dishonor your memory or her grief by speaking of this. But I wanted to confess this, at least on paper, to the one person who might understand both my obligation and my impossible position. Your friend, Nathaniel Ruth, sat perfectly still, the letter trembling in her hands. Nathaniel cared for her, not just as Thomas's widow, not just as a woman in need of protection, but as a woman he admired, perhaps even desired. The knowledge sent a warm current through her veins, followed immediately by confusion and guilt. She carefully replaced the letters exactly as she had found them, then extinguished the lamp and returned to her room. Sleep remained elusive as she turned over this new information in her mind. Nathaniel's proposal of marriage took on new dimensions, knowing it wasn't merely practical for him, that he harbored feelings he believed he had no right to express. And what of her own feelings? In the weeks since coming to the ranch, Ruth had grown to respect Nathaniel, to appreciate his quiet strength and unwavering support. She had even come to depend on his presence, to find comfort in their shared silences. But was that gratitude, friendship, or something more that she had not allowed herself to acknowledge? Dawn found her still awake, no closer to a decision, but with a clearer understanding of the man who awaited her answer. Nathaniel was already in the kitchen when Ruth emerged from her room, his expression carefully neutral as he set a cup of coffee before her. "Did you sleep?" he asked, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. "Not much," she admitted. No." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time. Finally, Ruth took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she began. Nathaniel's hands stilled around his coffee cup. "And before I give you my answer, there's something I need to know." Ruth met his gaze directly. "Why did you stop practicing medicine? The real reason." If her question surprised him, he didn't show it. Instead, he set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "After the war, I tried to go back to normal practice, but the memories followed me. I'd be setting a broken arm, and suddenly I'd be back in a field hospital sawing through a young boy's shattered limb while he screamed." Nathaniel's voice was flat, clinical, as if describing someone else's nightmare. "I started drinking to dull the memories. It helped for a while, until it didn't." He paused, his jaw working. "I lost a patient, a young woman having her first child. Simple case, should have been routine. But I froze at a critical moment, lost in a flashback. By the time I came back to myself, she was bleeding out. Nothing I could do." Ruth's heart ached for him. "It wasn't your fault. The war. She trusted me with her life." Nathaniel cut in, his voice suddenly harsh. "Her husband trusted me, and I failed them because I couldn't control my own mind." He drew a ragged breath. "I gave up medicine that day, came out here where I couldn't hurt anyone else, where the only life in my hands would be my own." "Until the flood," Ruth said softly. "Until me." Nathaniel nodded once, finally meeting her eyes. "Until you." Understanding flooded through her. His guilt over Thomas's death, his care for her, his offer of marriage, all were bound up in his deeper guilt over the lives he couldn't save, the trust he believed he had betrayed. "I'll marry you," Ruth said. Nathaniel stared at her clearly, not expecting such a direct response after his confession. "You don't have to." "I know." She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough to feel the warmth of his skin. "But it makes sense, as you said. And I trust you, Nathaniel. Whatever you believe about yourself, I trust you." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a release of tension he'd carried for so long. "The pastor can perform the ceremony this afternoon. Simple, private." Ruth nodded. "That would be best." The remainder of the morning passed in practical preparations. Nathaniel rode to town to speak with Pastor Porter, while Ruth looked through the small collection of clothes left behind by Nathaniel's mother, selecting a pale yellow dress that might serve as wedding attire. It was old-fashioned but clean and well-preserved, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. As she dressed, Ruth reflected on the strange path that had led her to this day. 6 months ago, she had been a happily married woman with dreams of children and a long life with Thomas. Now she was preparing to wed a man she barely knew, a man haunted by his own demons in a ceremony of convenience rather than love. And yet there was something about Nathaniel, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, the depth of feeling he kept carefully contained, that stirred emotions Ruth had thought died with Thomas in the floodwaters. Pastor Porter arrived mid-afternoon, his kind face solemn as he greeted Ruth. "Mrs. Morgan, are you certain about this course of action? Marriage is not a step to be taken lightly, even under these circumstances." "I'm certain," Ruth said, surprised to find she meant it. "Nathaniel has been more than kind. This arrangement will benefit us both." The pastor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Mr. Hayes is waiting on the porch. Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was brief and simple. On the back porch, with the prairie stretching endlessly before them, Ruth and Nathaniel exchanged vows. No rings were exchanged. There had been no time to procure them. But Pastor Porter pronounced them husband and wife, with the same solemnity he would have used for a grand church wedding. "You may kiss the bride," he said, finally closing his Bible. Ruth felt her cheeks warm as Nathaniel hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed with this part of the ceremony. After a moment, he leaned down and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to her forehead. The simple gesture held more tenderness than Ruth had expected, and she felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. After the pastor departed, a strange awkwardness descended between them. They were husband and wife-in-law, but nothing had truly changed. Ruth would still occupy her separate room, Nathaniel his. Their daily routines would continue as before. And yet everything had changed in subtle, indefinable ways. "I should start supper," Nathaniel said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll help," Ruth offered, wheeling herself toward the kitchen. They worked together, preparing a simple meal, moving around each other, with the careful awareness of two people adjusting to a new dynamic. As they ate, the tension gradually eased, replaced by the comfortable silence they had established in their weeks together. "What happens tomorrow?" Ruth asked as they finished their meal. "At the hearing, we go to town, present ourselves as husband and wife. Hodge's petition becomes irrelevant." Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. "He won't be pleased." "No," Ruth agreed. "He won't." Later, as Nathaniel prepared to retire to his room, he paused in the doorway. "Ruth," he began, then seemed to struggle for words. "I want you to know that I meant what I said in the ceremony. I will honor and protect you to the best of my ability." Ruth nodded, touched by his sincerity. "I know you will. Good night, husband." The word felt strange on her tongue, but not unpleasant. Nathaniel's eyes warmed briefly before he nodded and withdrew to his room. Alone in her bed, Ruth thought about the letters she had read about Nathaniel's unspoken feelings for her. How strange that fate had brought them together like this. Through Thomas, through tragedy, through Nathaniel's determination to keep a promise made long ago. She wondered what Thomas would think of this arrangement. Would he understand that it was born of necessity and Nathaniel's sense of obligation, or would he see something more? The potential for genuine affection between his widow and his friend. As sleep finally claimed her, Ruth found herself hoping that wherever Thomas was, he would approve of the unusual path her life had taken. The courthouse in town was an imposing brick building with white columns flanking the entrance. Ruth felt small as Nathaniel wheeled her up the ramp that had been hastily constructed for her appearance, a concession to propriety rather than genuine concern for her accessibility. Inside the hearing room was already crowded. Word had spread about the unusual case. The paralyzed widow, her husband's grasping uncle, the valuable land at stake. Curious townspeople filled the benches, eager for the drama to unfold. Wesley Hodge sat at a table near the front, his thin face set in lines of smug confidence. Beside him sat a sharply dressed lawyer from the county seat, shuffling papers with an air of bored competence. When Hodge caught sight of Ruth and Nathaniel, his expression soured, clearly displeased to see her looking well cared for, rather than the pitiable invalid he had likely described to the judge. Judge Harper, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair and bushy eyebrows, entered from a side door. The room rose, then settled as he took his seat and adjusted his spectacles. Case of Hodge petitioning for guardianship of Ruth Morgan, he announced, glancing at the papers before him. Mr. Hodge claims Mrs. Morgan is of unsound mind and body following an accident, unable to manage her affairs, including property left to her by her late husband. He peered over his glasses. Is the petitioner present? Hodge's lawyer stood. Wesley Hodge is present, Your Honor, as am I, Edward Cromwell, representing Mr. Hodge's interests. The judge nodded. And Mrs. Morgan? Nathaniel stood. Your Honor, there has been a development. Mrs. Morgan is now Mrs. Hayes. We were married yesterday afternoon with Pastor Porter officiating. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Hodge half rose from his seat, his face contorted with anger before his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. Judge Harper's bushy eyebrows rose. Is this true, Mrs. Hayes? It is, Your Honor. Ruth confirmed, her voice steady, despite the butterflies in her stomach. Mr. Hayes and I were legally wed yesterday. The judge studied them for a moment, then turned to Hodge's lawyer. Mr. Cromwell, as I'm sure you're aware, a married woman's legal guardian is her husband. If Mrs. Morgan is now Mrs. Hayes, this petition is moot. Cromwell cleared his throat. Your Honor, we question the legitimacy of this sudden marriage. It appears to be a transparent attempt to circumvent my client's rightful concern for his niece by marriage. Rightful concern? Nathaniel's voice was dangerously quiet. Hodge left her in the market square like unwanted livestock. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harper banged his gavel. Order! He fixed Nathaniel with a stern look. Mr. Hayes, you will address the court through me, not directly to the petitioner. Apologies, Your Honor, Nathaniel said, though his gaze remained locked on Hodge. Judge Harper turned to Cromwell. Do you have evidence that this marriage is invalid? Not at present, Your Honor, but then the petition is dismissed. The judge banged his gavel once more. Mrs. Hayes is legally under the guardianship of her husband. Mr. Hodge has no standing. Hodge surged to his feet. This is an outrage. She can't manage that land. She's crippled, half mad with grief. Mr. Hodge, Judge Harper's voice cracked like a whip. "One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt." He turned to Ruth, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Hayes, are you satisfied with this arrangement?" Ruth straightened in her chair. "I am, Your Honor. Mr. Hayes has provided me with a home with support in my recovery and with the means to rebuild my life after tragedy. I could ask for no better guardian or husband." The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then this matter is closed." He gathered his papers and stood. Court dismissed. As the spectators began to file out, many casting curious glances at the newly married couple, Hodge pushed past his lawyer and approached Ruth and Nathaniel. His face was mottled with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. "That land should have been mine. Thomas promised it to me." "Thomas would never have promised you anything," Ruth said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And the deed is in my name, not yours." Hodge's gaze shifted to Nathaniel. "You think you're clever, Hayes, marrying a cripple for her land?" His lip curled. "Hope you enjoy bedding damaged goods." Nathaniel moved so quickly Ruth barely saw it. One moment Hodge was sneering, the next he was pinned against the wall, Nathaniel's forearm across his throat. "Speak of my wife that way again," Nathaniel said, his voice deadly quiet, "and they'll find what's left of you in a ditch." "Nathaniel!" Ruth's voice cut through the tension. "He's not worth it." For a moment, she thought Nathaniel wouldn't listen. Then, with visible effort, he released Hodge and stepped back. "Stay away from my ranch. Stay away from my wife. This is your only warning." Hodge straightened his jacket, his eyes glittering with malice. "Like I said, this isn't over." With that, he turned and stalked from the courtroom, his lawyer hurrying after him. In the sudden quiet, Ruth reached for Nathaniel's hand. "Let's go home," she said softly. The ride back to the ranch was silent, both of them processing the confrontation with Hodge. Ruth could feel the tension radiating from Nathaniel, his hands tight on the reins, his jaw clenched. She had never seen him lose control like that, had never witnessed the violence simmering beneath his calm exterior. It should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself touched by his fierce protectiveness, even as she worried about Hodge's parting threat. "He won't give up easily," she said as they turned onto the lane leading to the ranch. "He wants that land badly." Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. "I know. We'll need to be careful." He glanced at her. "I'm sorry for losing my temper. It was unprofessional." A small smile touched Ruth's lips. "We're not doctor and patient, Nathaniel. We're husband and wife, remember, and he deserved worse than he got." Something in Nathaniel's posture eased at her words. By the time they reached the house, the worst of the tension had dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. They had won the first battle against Hodge. The land was secure, at least, for now. As Nathaniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle around her waist, Ruth felt a strange flutter in her chest. Not fear or anxiety, but something warmer, more complicated. For the first time since the flood, she felt truly safe. The next morning, Ruth woke to find a folded paper on the floor, as if it had been slipped under her door during the night. Opening it, she found a note in Nathaniel's precise handwriting. Ruth gone to check the north pasture fence. Back by midday. Pastor Porter mentioned Martha Simmons might call today. She expressed concern for your welfare after the hearing. Please remember, our marriage doesn't change your freedom or independence. This is still your home, your life to shape as you choose. Ruth read the note twice, touched by Nathaniel's reassurance. Even in a marriage of convenience, he was determined to respect her autonomy, to ensure she didn't feel trapped by their arrangement. She dressed and wheeled herself to the kitchen, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast. As she ate, she contemplated the strangeness of her new situation. She was now Ruth Hayes, a married woman again, after just months of widowhood. Yet nothing had truly changed in her daily life. She still had her separate room, still went about her tasks independently, still shared meals and quiet evenings with Nathaniel as before. The only difference was the legal protection his name provided, and perhaps a new awareness between them, a subtle shift in how they regarded each other. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. A wagon was coming up the lane, driven by Martha Simmons. The older woman pulled up to the house and secured the reins before making her way to the porch, a basket over her arm. "Mrs. Hayes," Martha greeted her when Ruth opened the door. "May I come in?" "Of course," Ruth said, wheeling back to allow her entry. "Please call me Ruth." Martha set her basket on the kitchen table. "I've brought some preserves, blackberry and peach, and fresh bread." She glanced around the neat kitchen. "Mr. Hayes keeps a tidy house for a bachelor. Or I suppose he's not a bachelor anymore, is he?" Ruth smiled at the thinly veiled curiosity. "Would you like coffee, Mrs. Simmons?" "Martha, please." The older woman settled at the table while Ruth poured 2 cups. "I must say your marriage caused quite a stir in town. Very sudden." "Yes," Ruth acknowledged, joining her at the table, "but necessary, given the circumstances." Martha studied her over the rim of her cup. "Hodge is a nasty piece of work. Always has been, even as a boy. No one blamed you for finding protection where you could." She hesitated, then added more gently, "But are you content? My dear Mr. Hayes is a good man by all accounts, but marriage is a serious step, especially so soon after your loss." Ruth considered the question carefully. "Nathaniel has been kind, respectful. He's given me a home, taught me to be independent, despite—" She gestured at her legs. "He asks nothing in return, except that I continue to heal, to grow stronger." "Nothing?" Martha's eyebrows rose significantly. Ruth felt her cheeks warm as she understood the older woman's meaning. "Our arrangement is not traditional in all respects." "Ah," Martha nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, that's between you and him, of course, but if you ever need a woman to talk to—" She patted Ruth's hand. "Being alone out here, just the two of you, it can be isolating." "Thank you," Ruth said, genuinely touched by the offer. "I've had little company these past months." "Then I shall visit more often," Martha declared. "And perhaps you might join our quilting circle in town. We meet every Tuesday at the church. Several of the ladies expressed interest in making your acquaintance after seeing you at the hearing." The thought of regular social interaction, of female friendship after months of isolation, appealed to Ruth more than she had expected. "I'd like that very much." Martha stayed for an hour, sharing town gossip and practical advice for managing a household. By the time she departed, Ruth felt lighter than she had in weeks. The simple pleasure of female companionship, a balm to her spirit. She was still smiling when Nathaniel returned from the pasture, his clothes dusty from fence mending. "Mrs. Simmons visited?" he asked, noticing the second coffee cup on the table. "Yes," Ruth said. "She brought preserves and an invitation to join the quilting circle in town." Nathaniel nodded approvingly as he washed his hands at the basin. "Good. You should have friends' connections beyond this ranch." He hesitated, then added, "I know it's been isolated here." "I haven't minded," Ruth said truthfully. After everything that happened, the quiet was healing. "Still," Nathaniel dried his hands on a towel. "A person needs more than silence and routine." Ruth studied him, noting the new openness in his manner since their marriage, the slight relaxation of the rigid control he usually maintained. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you need, Nathaniel?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stilled towel in hand, his expression thoughtful. "I've grown used to solitude," he said finally. "Perhaps too used to it." "That's not an answer." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, it isn't." He hung the towel on its hook and met her gaze directly. "I need to know I'm not causing harm. That my presence in the world is constructive rather than destructive. Beyond that, I've learned to need very little." Ruth thought of the letters she'd read, of the guilt that had driven him from medicine to isolation. "You've never harmed me," she said softly. "Only helped healed." Something flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. "I'm glad." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Ruth found herself studying Nathaniel's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the weathered creases around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. He had been a handsome man in his youth, she realized, and age had only added character to his features. "You're staring," he said without looking at her. Ruth smiled, not embarrassed at being caught. "I was thinking that for a husband, you're still something of a mystery to me." Nathaniel turned to her, then his expression softening in the fading light. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "Where you were born, what you were like as a boy, how you decided to become a doctor." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "That might take more than one evening." "We have time," Ruth said. "Unless you have other plans." The corner of his mouth quirked upward, not quite a smile, but close. "No other plans." And so, as darkness settled over the prairie and stars emerged in the velvet sky, Nathaniel Hayes began to tell his story. Born in Ohio to a schoolteacher father and a mother who tended the sick in their small town. A quiet, serious boy who preferred books to games, who followed his mother on her rounds and marveled at her ability to ease suffering. Medical school in Philadelphia, interrupted by the war. The horrors of battlefield surgery, the impossible choices, the lives saved and lost. Ruth listened occasionally, asking questions, but mostly allowing him to speak at his own pace, to share as much or as little as he felt comfortable revealing. It was the most he had ever spoken at one time, and she sensed it was cathartic for him, this unburdening of memories long kept private. When he finally fell silent, the night was deep around them, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "Thank you," Ruth said softly, "for sharing that with me." Nathaniel nodded, his expression peaceful in a way she hadn't seen before. "It's been a long time since I spoke of those years. Too long, perhaps." He considered this, then nodded again. "Perhaps." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer before Nathaniel rose and offered his hand to help her back inside. It was a small gesture, but Ruth felt its significance, a tiny bridging of the careful distance he had maintained since bringing her to the ranch. That night, as she prepared for bed, Ruth found herself thinking not of Thomas, as she usually did, but of Nathaniel, his quiet strength, his hidden depths, the gentle way he had begun to open himself to her. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had anticipated. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Each morning, Ruth and Nathaniel would share breakfast before he headed out to work the ranch. Ruth would tend to her usual tasks, feeding the chickens, working in the garden, but now she added new activities to her routine. She began sorting through the books in Nathaniel's small library, organizing them on lower shelves where she could reach them from her chair. She started a simple quilt from scraps of fabric Martha had brought her fingers, remembering the skills her mother had taught her long ago. In the evenings they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Nathaniel continued working on restoring her Bible, carefully separating damaged pages and reinforcing the weakened spine. Ruth in turn mended his clothes, noting with amusement that for a man who could sew a neat seam, he often neglected tears in his own shirts and trousers. Each night, they would say goodnight at their respective doors, their marriage unchanged in its physical aspects. Yet Ruth found herself increasingly aware of Nathaniel as a man. The breadth of his shoulders when he reached for something on a high shelf, the grace of his hands as he worked the rare smile that transformed his serious face. She wondered if he thought of her in similar ways, if the feelings he had confessed in his unsent letter to Thomas had grown or diminished now that they were legally bound. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something beyond the care of a doctor for a patient, beyond the obligation of a friend keeping a promise. A week after their marriage, Ruth joined the quilting circle in town for the first time. Nathaniel drove her in the wagon, helping her into the chair with practiced ease before heading to the mercantile for supplies. The women of the circle welcomed her warmly, their initial curiosity about her unusual marriage quickly giving way to genuine interest in her as a person. "Mr. Hayes seems a good man," said Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, as she stitched a neat row of squares. "Quiet, keeps to himself, but always fair in his dealings." "He was a doctor, I hear," added another woman, "during the war. My husband says he was the best surgeon in the regiment." "Why did he stop practicing?" asked a younger woman, immediately hushed by Martha. "Don't be nosy, Rebecca," Martha scolded. "Some things aren't for public discussion." Ruth smiled, grateful for Martha's intervention. "He's been very kind," she said simply. "I'm fortunate." The conversation turned to other topics: town gossip, recipes, plans for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Ruth found herself enjoying the simple camaraderie, the easy flow of female conversation after months of isolation. When Nathaniel returned to collect her 2 hours later, she felt refreshed, reconnected to the world beyond the ranch, in a way she hadn't been since the flood. "You enjoyed yourself," Nathaniel observed as they drove home, not a question, but a statement. "I did," Ruth confirmed. "They've invited me back next week." "Good." He glanced at her approval, evident in his expression. "You're looking stronger, healthier." Ruth realized he was right. The hollow-cheeked, haunted woman who had arrived at the ranch 2 months ago was slowly being replaced by someone more vital, more present. She still couldn't walk, still carried the grief of Thomas's death, but she was healing in ways that went beyond the physical. "It's because of you," she said quietly. "What you've done for me." Nathaniel shook his head. "I only provided the space. The strength was always yours." That evening, as Ruth prepared for bed, she felt a strange tingling in her right leg. Not quite feeling, but something more than the deadened numbness she had grown accustomed to. She stared down at her leg, willing it to move to confirm what she thought she had felt. Nothing happened. Perhaps it had been her imagination, a phantom sensation like those Nathaniel had described in wounded soldiers who felt pain in limbs long amputated. Still, the possibility that some sensation might be returning filled her with cautious hope. She decided not to mention it to Nathaniel yet. After months of disappointment, she didn't want to raise false hopes, his or her own. Instead, she settled into bed, her mind turning to the coming days, to the slowly expanding world that had seemed so hopelessly narrowed after the flood. She was nearly asleep when a sound jerked her to alertness, the crash of breaking glass, followed by a muffled curse, and the thud of footsteps on the porch. Ruth sat up, heart pounding. Someone was trying to break into the house. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice tight with fear. His door opened immediately, as if he had been awake and alert. "Stay in your room," he ordered, already moving toward the front of the house, a rifle in his hands. "Lock the door." Ruth wheeled herself to the door and secured the lock, then moved to the window, straining to hear what was happening. There were voices outside, several men, their words indistinct, but their tone threatening. Then Nathaniel's voice, steady and authoritative, ordering them off his property. A shot rang out, splintering the night. Ruth gasped, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles whitened. More shouting followed another shot. Then the sound of horses galloping away. For a long, terrible moment, silence fell. Then Nathaniel's voice at her door. "Ruth, it's safe now. They're gone." She unlocked the door with trembling hands. Nathaniel stood in the hallway, rifle still in hand, his expression grim but composed. "Who was it?" she asked, searching his body for signs of injury. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he assured her. "It was Hodge and some hired men. Thought they could intimidate us, I suspect." His jaw tightened. "They won't try again soon. I recognized two of them, Hodge's foreman and one of the hands from the neighboring spread. They know I saw their faces." Relief washed through Ruth, followed quickly by renewed fear. "This is about the land, isn't it? He won't stop." Nathaniel set the rifle aside and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me, Ruth. I won't let him harm you or take what's rightfully yours. I promise you that." The intensity in his eyes, the firm pressure of his hands on hers, steadied her racing heart. "I know," she said softly. "I trust you." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression at her words. A softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. For a moment, Ruth thought he might say more, might cross the careful boundary they had maintained despite their marriage. Instead, he squeezed her hands once and rose. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch the rest of the night." But sleep proved elusive for Ruth. The attack had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not just for her own safety, but for Nathaniel's. He had placed himself in danger by marrying her, by standing between her and Hodge's greed. The thought of him being hurt because of her was unbearable. When dawn finally broke, Ruth gave up on sleep and dressed for the day. She found Nathaniel on the porch, rifle across his knees, his gaze scanning the horizon. He looked tired, but alert, the set of his shoulders revealing the soldier and protector beneath the quiet rancher's exterior. "You should have slept," she said, wheeling herself beside him. "Couldn't." He glanced at her, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. "Neither did you." "No." Ruth followed his gaze across the peaceful morning landscape, so at odds with the violence of the night before. "What do we do now?" Nathaniel was silent for a moment, considering. "We could sell the land," he said finally. "Give Hodge what he wants. It might be the simplest solution." Ruth shook her head immediately. "No, Thomas wanted me to have that land. I won't let Hodge take it, especially not through intimidation." A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "I thought you might say that." He rose, stretching muscles stiff from the night's vigil. "Then we fight. How? First, we inform the sheriff about last night's incident. Establish a record of Hodge's harassment." Nathaniel's voice was calm, methodical. "Then we make it clear we're not easily frightened. I'll hire a couple of hands to help around the ranch, extra eyes and guns if needed." The practical approach reassured Ruth. Nathaniel wasn't suggesting they face Hodge alone, nor was he proposing they surrender what was rightfully hers. It was a measured response to a genuine threat. "All right," she agreed. "But, Nathaniel, be careful. I couldn't bear it if you were hurt because of me." His expression softened. "I've survived worse, Ruth. We both have." Later that morning, as Nathaniel prepared to ride into town to speak with the sheriff, Ruth wheeled herself to the garden to check on her vegetables. The routine task helped calm her nerves, grounding her in the present, rather than dwelling on the dangers that might lie ahead. As she worked, she became aware of a figure approaching from the direction of the road. A woman on foot, moving slowly but purposefully toward the house. It took Ruth a moment to recognize Martha Simmons, her usually neat appearance disheveled, a bruise darkening one cheek. "Martha," Ruth called, alarmed. "What happened?" The older woman reached the garden gate and leaned against it, clearly exhausted. "Hodge," she said grimly, "came to my place this morning, demanded to know what I'd told you about him. When I wouldn't answer, She gestured to her bruised face. "Oh, Martha." Ruth wheeled herself forward, taking the older woman's hand. "Come inside. Let me tend to that." In the kitchen, Ruth prepared a cold compress for Martha's bruise, then poured her a cup of strong tea. "Nathaniel has gone to town to speak with the sheriff about Hodge," she explained. "He and some men came here last night, tried to break in." Martha's eyes widened. "Were you hurt?" "No, Nathaniel drove them off." Ruth hesitated, then asked, "Why would Hodge come to you? What did he think you knew?" Martha sipped her tea before answering. "He thinks I know something about the land, Thomas's land by Willow Creek. He kept asking if Thomas had told me why it was valuable if I knew what was on it." Ruth frowned, puzzled. "It's just land, isn't it? Good farmland, perhaps. But I don't know," Martha admitted. "But Hodge seems convinced there's more to it. He was almost desperate." She set down her cup, her expression grave. "Be careful, Ruth. Whatever he thinks is on that land, he's willing to hurt people to get it." The sound of hoofbeats announced Nathaniel's return. He entered the kitchen, stopping short at the sight of Martha with her bruised face. "Mrs. Simmons," he said immediately, assessing her injury with a doctor's eye. "What happened?" Martha repeated her story. Nathaniel's expression darkened with each word, the controlled anger Ruth had glimpsed during the courthouse confrontation returning to his features. "Did you report this to the sheriff?" he asked when Martha finished. "No," she admitted. "I came straight here. Thought you should know." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "You were right to come. The sheriff is already looking for Hodge. I told him about last night's incident. This will strengthen the case against him." He turned to Ruth. "I've hired 2 hands from the Peterson spread. Good men, reliable. They'll be here by nightfall." To Martha he added, "You should stay here tonight, Mrs. Simmons. It's not safe for you to return home alone." Martha looked like she might protest, then nodded clearly, too shaken to argue. "Thank you." As Nathaniel went to prepare the spare room for their unexpected guest, Martha turned to Ruth, her expression thoughtful. "He cares for you," she said quietly. "More than just obligation or responsibility." Ruth felt a warmth rise in her cheeks. "Our arrangement is—" "I know what you told me," Martha interrupted gently, "but I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and how you look at him." She patted Ruth's hand. "Life is too short and too uncertain to waste on pretense, my dear, especially out here." Before Ruth could respond, Nathaniel returned. "The room is ready," he told Martha. "You should rest. I'll ride into town later to inform the sheriff about what happened to you." Martha thanked him and withdrew to the spare room, leaving Ruth and Nathaniel alone in the kitchen. For a moment, neither spoke, the events of the past 24 hours weighing heavily between them. "Hodge thinks there's something valuable on the land," Ruth said finally. "That's what he was asking Martha about." Nathaniel nodded. "The sheriff mentioned rumors of a survey crew working near Willow Creek last year. Nothing came of it as far as he knows." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Ruth had come to recognize as a sign of worry. "Whatever Hodge believes is there, it's made him desperate." and dangerous. What do? We need to see the land for ourselves, Nathaniel decided. Tomorrow we'll ride out to Willow Creek. Maybe there's something there that explains Hodge's fixation. The thought of visiting the land Thomas had left her, land she had never seen, filled Ruth with a mixture of anticipation and dread. It was her last connection to her first husband, a gift he had never had the chance to tell her about. And now it had become the center of a conflict that threatened her new life with Nathaniel. "All right," she agreed. "Tomorrow." That night, with Martha safely installed in the spare room and 2 hired hands keeping watch outside, Ruth lay awake thinking of what the morning might bring. The land by Willow Creek represented both her past and her future, Thomas's final gift, and the reason for her marriage to Nathaniel. She wondered what they would find there, what secret Hodge was so desperate to possess that he would resort to violence and intimidation. Whatever it was, Ruth was determined not to let him take what was rightfully hers, not just for her own sake, but for Thomas's memory and for the future she was slowly building with Nathaniel. A future that she was beginning to realize she wanted to be more than just a marriage of convenience. Morning came with a pearly light that softened the harsh lines of the prairie. Ruth woke early, her mind already turning to the journey ahead. Today, they would visit Thomas's land by Willow Creek. Land she had never seen, land that had somehow become the center of Hodge's dangerous obsession. She dressed carefully in her riding skirt, remembering the special frame Nathaniel had built to allow her to ride despite her paralysis. The thought of traveling beyond the boundaries of the ranch both excited and frightened her. She had not ventured further than town since coming to live with Nathaniel, had grown accustomed to the safe confines of the house and yard. When she wheeled herself to the kitchen, she found Martha already up, preparing breakfast. The bruise on the older woman's face had darkened overnight, but her movements were brisk, her manner composed. "Good morning," Martha greeted her. "Mr. Hayes is out with the men checking the perimeter. He said to tell you they'll have the horses ready after breakfast." Ruth nodded, pouring herself coffee. "How are you feeling?" "I've had worse," Martha said, with the pragmatism of a woman who had weathered many storms. "The bruise will fade. It's you I'm worried about." She turned from the stove, her expression serious. "Hodge is desperate. Whatever is on that land, it's made him reckless." "All the more reason to find out what it is," Ruth said, though a flutter of anxiety stirred in her chest. "Knowledge is protection." Martha studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You've changed since that day in the market. Grown stronger." "I had help," Ruth acknowledged, thinking of Nathaniel's patient support, his unwavering belief in her capabilities, even when she doubted herself. "Yes," Martha agreed with a knowing smile. "You did." The door opened, and Nathaniel entered with the 2 hired hands, solid, weathered men named Miller and Dawson. They had kept watch through the night, alert for any sign of Hodge's return. "All quiet," Nathaniel reported, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "No tracks, no sign anyone's been near the property since yesterday." Ruth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the upcoming journey weighing on everyone's minds. Martha would remain at the ranch with Miller, while Nathaniel, Ruth, and Dawson rode to Willow Creek. The plan was simple: see the land, look for anything unusual that might explain Hodge's interest, and return before dark. As they finished eating, Nathaniel turned to Ruth. "Are you sure you're up for this? It's a long ride." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "It's my land. I need to see it." He nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "We'll leave in half an hour." Outside, the morning had warmed, the spring sun gaining strength as it climbed higher. Dawson held the horses while Nathaniel helped Ruth into the special saddle frame. Pepper, the gentle mare, stood patiently as Ruth settled into position, testing the security of the frame before taking the reins. "Comfortable?" Nathaniel asked, his hand lingering briefly on her arm. Ruth nodded, a small thrill of anticipation replacing her earlier anxiety. "Let's go." They set off at an easy pace, Nathaniel riding beside Ruth Dawson, following a few paces behind. The prairie stretched around them, a sea of grass rippling in the breeze. In the distance, the dark line of trees marked the course of Willow Creek, their destination. As they rode, Ruth found herself studying the land with new eyes. Before the flood, she had taken the beauty of the Kansas prairie for granted. Now, after months of confinement, she drank in the open spaces, the endless sky, the vibrant green of spring growth. Freedom, she realized, was not just in the use of one's legs, but in the ability to move beyond the boundaries of fear and limitation. "You're smiling," Nathaniel observed, his own expression softening as he watched her. "It's beautiful out here," Ruth said simply. "I'd forgotten." He nodded in understanding. "The prairie has its own kind of healing. Not like medicine, but perhaps more effective in some ways." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horses' hooves, a soothing counterpoint to the whisper of wind through grass. After about an hour, they reached a small rise that offered a view of the creek below, a silver ribbon winding through a belt of cottonwoods and willows. "There," Nathaniel said, pointing to a stretch of land where the creek made a wide bend. "That's the Morgan property, 40 acres, according to the deed." Ruth shaded her eyes against the sun, taking in the sight of Thomas's final gift to her. The land was beautiful, a perfect mixture of rolling grassland and shaded creek-bottom rich soil that would support crops or cattle with equal generosity. "It's lovely," she said softly, "but I don't see anything unusual, nothing that would make Hodge so desperate to possess it." "Let's take a closer look," Nathaniel suggested, guiding his horse down the gentle slope toward the creek. They rode along the edge of the property, Nathaniel occasionally consulting a map he had obtained from the county clerk. The land showed no signs of recent human presence, no structures, no fences, no evidence of the survey crew the sheriff had mentioned. Near the creek, they dismounted, Nathaniel lifting Ruth from the saddle frame to her wheelchair, which Dawson had carried folded on his horse. While Dawson watered the horses, Nathaniel pushed Ruth's chair along the bank, both of them scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. "Thomas never mentioned this land?" Nathaniel asked as they paused in the shade of a massive cottonwood. Ruth shook her head. "Never. The first I heard of it was when you told me Hodge wanted guardianship to control it." She looked around, still puzzled by the mystery. "He must have bought it just before the flood." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the slow-moving water of the creek. "Did Thomas ever mention a surveyor named William Jenkins?" Ruth frowned, trying to recall. "I don't think so." "Why?" "The sheriff mentioned him yesterday. Said he was working in this area last year, taking soil and water samples." Nathaniel crouched beside her chair, his voice dropping. "Jenkins disappeared about 6 months ago. No one's seen him since." A chill ran through Ruth, despite the warm spring air. "You think Hodge—" "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted. "But it's odd timing. Jenkins vanishes. Then Thomas suddenly buys this land, then dies in the flood before he can tell you about it." The implications were disturbing. If Hodge had harmed the surveyor, if Thomas had somehow discovered what was on the land, and purchased it before Hodge could, then the flood that had claimed her husband's life might have been more than a tragic accident in Hodge's mind. It might have been an opportunity. "We need to find what Jenkins found," Ruth said, her resolve strengthening. Whatever is here that made Thomas buy this land and makes Hodge willing to hurt people to get it. They continued their search, methodically covering the property as best they could, with Ruth's limited mobility. Near midday, as they approached the far boundary where the creek made its sharpest bend, Dawson called out from several yards ahead. "Mr. Hayes, you might want to see this." Nathaniel hurried forward, leaving Ruth momentarily as he joined Dawson at the creek's edge. Ruth watched as the two men crouched examining something on the ground. After a brief conference, Nathaniel returned to her, his expression grave. "There's a spring feeding into the creek here," he explained. "The water has a strange color and smell, and there are markers, small metal stakes driven into the ground in a pattern. Someone was definitely surveying this specific spot." "What does it mean?" Ruth asked. "I'm not certain," Nathaniel admitted, "but I have a theory." He glanced back at the discolored spring. "Oil, or natural gas. The survey crew must have found signs of a deposit beneath this land." Ruth's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "That's why Hodge wants it so badly. If there's oil here, it could be worth a fortune," Nathaniel confirmed. "Far more than the value of the land for farming or ranching." The pieces fell into place with disturbing clarity. Hodge's desperation, his escalating violence, Thomas's sudden purchase of the property all made sense if the land contained valuable mineral rights. Thomas must have learned about the survey results perhaps from Jenkins himself and acquired the land before Hodge could act. "We should take samples," Ruth decided. "Proof of what's here. Then we can speak with a proper expert, confirm our suspicions." Nathaniel nodded, already searching for suitable containers. He found an empty canteen and a glass medicine bottle in his saddlebag, filling both with the strangely colored water from the spring. As he worked, Ruth couldn't help but admire his methodical approach, the careful precision that revealed his medical training. "There's something else," Dawson called, having continued his exploration of the area. "Looks like someone camped here recently. Fire pit's not more than a week old." Nathaniel and Ruth exchanged concerned glances. "Hodge," she suggested. "Possibly," Nathaniel agreed. "Or someone working for him. Either way, they're watching this land closely." The discovery lent urgency to their departure. If Hodge or his men were monitoring the property, Ruth and Nathaniel needed to return to the safety of the ranch before they were discovered. With the water samples secured, they mounted up and began the journey home, riding at a faster pace than before. About halfway back to the ranch, Dawson, who had been scouting slightly ahead, suddenly reined in his horse and raised a hand in warning. Nathaniel immediately guided Pepper closer to Ruth, his body tensing with alertness. "Riders coming," Dawson reported in a low voice. "3 of them moving fast, Bernice, from the direction of town." Nathaniel's hand moved to the rifle in his saddle holster. "Can you tell who?" Dawson squinted against the afternoon sun. "Not yet, but they're pushing their horses hard." There was no cover on the open prairie, nowhere to hide or evade the approaching riders. Ruth felt her heart begin to race, fear tightening her throat. If it was Hodge and his men, they were vulnerable out here even with Dawson's help. "If it's trouble," Nathaniel said quietly to Ruth, "you ride for the ranch. Don't stop. Don't look back. Pepper knows the way." "I won't leave you," Ruth protested. Nathaniel's gaze was steady and tense. "Yes, you will, because I need to know you're safe. Promise me, Ruth." Something in his voice, the barely contained fear beneath the calm command, made her nod. "I promise." The riders drew closer, close enough now for Dawson to make out their features. To everyone's relief, he relaxed slightly. "It's the sheriff," he reported, "and 2 deputies." Nathaniel released a slow breath, his hand moving away from his rifle. "Good. But why are they riding so hard? They soon had their answer. Sheriff Taylor, a grizzled man with a weathered face and keen eyes, reined in his lathered horse before them, his expression grim. "Hayes," he greeted Nathaniel with a curt nod. "Mrs. Hayes, good we found you. There's trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Nathaniel asked, though Ruth suspected they both knew the answer. "Hodge," the sheriff confirmed. "He and some hired guns rode out to your place this morning. When we got word and went to check, we found your man Miller wounded. The Simmons woman is missing." Ruth gasped, horror washing through her. "Martha! He took Martha!" Sheriff Taylor nodded grimly. "Miller said Hodge was raving about the land, demanding to know where you two had gone. When Mrs. Simmons wouldn't tell him he took her, said you'd trade the land deed for her safety." Nathaniel's face hardened into a mask of controlled fury. "Is Miller badly hurt?" "Took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc Bennett's tending to him in town." The sheriff's gaze moved between them. "Hodge left a message. Said you have until sundown to bring the deed to his ranch, or—" He hesitated, glancing at Ruth. "Or what?" she demanded. "Or the old woman won't survive the night," the sheriff finished reluctantly. Ruth felt sick with fear and guilt. Martha had been drawn into this conflict because of her friendship, her kindness. Now she was in Hodge's hands, injured, frightened, all because of land Ruth hadn't even known she owned until a few weeks ago. "We have to help her," she said, looking to Nathaniel. "We can't let him hurt her." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "No, we can't." He turned to the sheriff. "How many men does Hodge have with him?" "At least 5 that Miller saw," Sheriff Taylor replied. "All armed. I've sent for more deputies from the county seat, but they won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest." The sun was already beginning its western descent. They had perhaps 4 hours until Hodge's deadline. Not enough time to gather more help to formulate a careful plan. They would have to act with what they had, with who they had. "We need to get Ruth safely to town," Nathaniel began, but Ruth immediately shook her head. "No, I'm coming with you." When Nathaniel started to protest, she cut him off. "This is my fight too, Nathaniel. Martha is in danger because of me. And it's my land Hodge wants." She could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to protect her warring with respect for her determination. Finally he nodded, though reluctance was evident in every line of his body. "All right, but you stay back, stay safe." His gaze locked with hers, intense and unwavering. "I can't lose you, Ruth. Not now." The simple declaration spoken in front of the sheriff and deputies carried more weight than any formal profession of love. Ruth felt it settle in her chest, a warm certainty amidst the fear and chaos of the moment. "You won't lose me," she promised, "but we need to save Martha." The plan they formulated was simple by necessity. The sheriff and 1 deputy would approach the Hodge ranch openly, ostensibly to negotiate for Martha's release. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, Ruth Dawson, and the 2nd deputy would circle around to the back of the property, using the cover of a small ravine to get close to the house undetected. "The deed," Ruth suddenly remembered. "Hodge wants the deed to the land, but it's at the ranch." Nathaniel shook his head. "I had a copy made after the hearing. It's in my saddlebag." At Ruth's surprised look, he added, "I thought it might be useful to have it with us when we visited the property." Always prepared, always thinking ahead. Ruth felt a rush of gratitude for Nathaniel's foresight, for his steady presence in this crisis. They rode hard, cutting across the prairie toward the Hodge ranch. As they neared, they split into their assigned groups, the sheriff and deputy continuing openly toward the main road, while the others veered off toward the ravine that would provide their cover. The Hodge ranch was smaller than Nathaniel's, the buildings older and less well-maintained. From their position in the ravine, They could see the main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Two men with rifles stood guard on the porch, while others could be glimpsed moving between structures. "Martha's likely in the house," Nathaniel murmured, studying the layout. "We need a distraction to draw some of those men away before we move in." The deputy, a young man named Collins, suggested setting fire to the hay stored behind the barn. "It's far enough from the house that they'll have to send men to deal with it, but close enough to cause real concern." Nathaniel nodded approval. "Good thinking. You and Dawson handle that. Wait for the sheriff to engage Hodge in negotiation, then set the fire. When the guards move to respond, I'll get to the house." "What about me?" Ruth asked. "I want to help." Nathaniel's expression softened as he looked at her. "You'll stay here with the horses, ready to ride if things go wrong." He must have seen the protest forming on her lips, because he added gently, "Please, Ruth, I need to know you're safe." She wanted to argue, to insist on being part of the rescue, but she recognized the wisdom in his request. In her wheelchair, she would be more vulnerable, potentially putting Martha and the others at greater risk if they had to protect her as well. "All right," she conceded. "But be careful. All of you." The sun was low on the horizon when Sheriff Taylor rode openly to the front of the Hodge ranch, his deputy beside him. From their hidden position, Ruth could hear his voice calling for Hodge, though the words were indistinct at this distance. After a few minutes, Hodge emerged onto the porch, his thin figure recognizable even from afar. The conversation appeared tense, with Hodge gesturing angrily, while the sheriff maintained a calm posture. "Now," Nathaniel whispered to Collins and Dawson. The two men slipped away, moving silently through the deepening shadows toward the barn. Minutes later, a plume of smoke rose from behind the barn, quickly followed by the orange glow of flames. Shouts of alarm rang out from the house. As they had hoped, several men, including the porch guards, ran toward the fire, leaving the house less protected. Nathaniel turned to Ruth, his expression grave. "Stay hidden. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, ride for town. Don't wait for anyone." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her. Not the chaste kiss of their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss, brief but fervent, filled with all the things neither of them had dared say aloud. "I'll be back," he promised against her lips. Then he was gone, slipping away toward the house with the silent grace of a man used to moving undetected. Ruth waited in an agony of tension, her eyes fixed on the house, straining to see any sign of movement, any indication of what was happening inside. The fire behind the barn had grown, casting an eerie glow over the ranch yard. Men shouted and ran with buckets, trying to prevent the flames from spreading to the main barn. The diversion was working perfectly, perhaps too well. If the fire grew out of control, it might endanger everyone, including Martha and Nathaniel. Ruth found herself praying something she had done less and less since the flood took Thomas and her faith along with him. "Please," she whispered to the darkening sky, "please let them be safe." 10 minutes passed. 15. The fire was beginning to die down, contained by the efforts of Hodge's men. Soon they would return to their posts, making escape more difficult. Ruth watched the house, anxiously willing the door to open for Nathaniel to emerge with Martha. Just as she was beginning to fear the worst, a flurry of activity erupted at the side of the house. Nathaniel appeared, supporting Martha, whose movements were slow but determined. Behind them came the sheriff, his gun drawn, backing toward them, while keeping his weapon trained on the house. A shot rang out, then another. Someone shouted in pain. Ruth's heart seized with fear as she saw Nathaniel stumble, then straighten, still moving toward the ravine with Martha. More shots followed, a chaotic exchange of gunfire, as Hodge's men realized what was happening and rushed back from the fire. Dawson and Collins provided covering fire from their positions, allowing Nathaniel and the sheriff to reach the relative safety of the ravine with Martha between them. "Ruth!" Nathaniel gasped as they reached her. "Take Martha. Get her on your horse." Ruth could see now that Nathaniel was wounded, a dark stain spreading across his left sleeve. But his eyes were clear, his movements purposeful, despite the pain he must be feeling. With Dawson's help, they got Martha mounted behind Ruth on Pepper. The older woman was pale but conscious, her hands gripping Ruth's waist with surprising strength. "The others?" Ruth asked anxiously. "Coming," Nathaniel assured her, though his voice was tight with pain. "Go now, we'll follow." "Not without you," Ruth insisted. "You're hurt." "It's just a graze," he said, though the spreading bloodstain belied his words. "Ruth, please, get Martha to safety." Before she could argue further, more shots echoed from the direction of the house. Hodge and his remaining men were advancing toward the ravine, firing as they came. "Go!" Nathaniel ordered, slapping Pepper's flank. The mare leaped forward, carrying Ruth and Martha away from the gunfire toward the open prairie and the road to town. Ruth wanted desperately to look back to see if Nathaniel and the others were following, but she kept her focus on guiding Pepper, on ensuring Martha's safety. The older woman clung to her, silent, but for her labored breathing. They had ridden perhaps half a mile when Ruth heard hoofbeats behind them. Fear surged through her. Had Hodge's men pursued them, until she recognized the silhouettes of Nathaniel the sheriff and the others? Relief weakened her grip on the reins momentarily before she steadied herself. As the group came together, Ruth could see that Nathaniel was still bleeding, his face pale in the fading light. The sheriff looked grim, but unharmed. Collins nursed what appeared to be a minor wound to his leg, while Dawson seemed unscathed. "Is everyone all right?" Ruth asked anxiously. "We will be," the sheriff assured her. "Let's get to town. Doc Bennett needs to look at Hayes and Collins." "And Hodge?" Ruth couldn't help asking. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Got away for now, but he shot at a lawman. That's a hanging offense. He won't get far." The ride to town seemed endless, each jolt of the horse sending fresh waves of concern through Ruth as she watched Nathaniel growing paler, his posture less certain in the saddle. By the time they reached the doctor's office on Main Street, he was swaying dangerously, kept upright more by will than strength. Dr. Bennett, a stocky man with kind eyes and capable hands, took charge immediately, directing Nathaniel and Collins to examination rooms while ordering his wife to tend to Martha. "It's more than a graze," Ruth overheard him telling the sheriff as they helped Nathaniel onto a table. "Bullet's still in there. He's lost a fair amount of blood." Ruth waited in the small reception area, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. Martha sat beside her, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea that Mrs. Bennett had prepared. Despite her ordeal, the older woman seemed more concerned for Ruth than herself. "He'll be all right," Martha said, patting Ruth's hand. "He's strong, your husband." "Yes," Ruth agreed, the word catching in her throat. "He is." An hour passed, then another. The sheriff came and went, organizing the search for Hodge and his men. Mrs. Bennett brought more tea, offered food that Ruth couldn't bring herself to eat. Collins emerged from his examination, his leg bandaged, but his step steady as he left to join the search. Finally, well past midnight, Dr. Bennett appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. Ruth straightened in her chair, her heart pounding with fear and hope. "He'll live," the doctor said without preamble, understanding her most pressing concern. "Bullet hit the shoulder, missed anything vital. He's lost blood, but he's young and healthy. With rest and care, he should recover fully." Relief crashed through Ruth like a physical force. "Can I see him?" Dr. Bennett nodded. "He's asking for you, but he needs rest, so keep it brief." Mrs. Bennet helped Ruth navigate her wheelchair through the narrow doorway into the examination room where Nathaniel lay. He was pale against the white sheets, his left shoulder heavily bandaged, but his eyes were clear as they found hers. "Ruth," he said, his voice weak but steady. "You're safe." She wheeled herself to his bedside, taking his hand in hers. "Yes, thanks to you." She swallowed hard, fighting tears. "You could have been killed." "Worth the risk," he murmured. "For Martha. For you." Ruth brought his hand to her cheek, no longer caring who might see what they might think. "Don't ever scare me like that again, Nathaniel Hayes." A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Bennet insisted that Nathaniel remain in his care overnight. Ruth refused to leave his side, maintaining her vigil in the uncomfortable wheelchair, despite Martha and Mrs. Bennet's urging that she rest. "I nearly lost him," she told Martha quietly, as the night deepened around them. "I can't leave him now." Martha's eyes softened with understanding. "You love him," she said. Not a question, but a gentle acknowledgement of truth. Ruth nodded, too exhausted for pretense. "I do. God help me, I do." "Why, God help you?" Martha asked. "Love is a blessing, not a curse." "Because I loved Thomas too," Ruth said, voicing the guilt that had nagged at her. "Is it disloyal to love again so soon, to feel this way about the man who was his friend?" Martha considered this, her weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. "I think," she said slowly, "that love is not a finite resource to be used up and gone. It grows where it's planted and tended." She patted Ruth's hand. "Thomas would want you to be happy to be loved, not to wither in grief." Ruth thought of Thomas, his laughter, his kindness, the life they had planned together before the flood swept it all away. Would he understand this unexpected turn her life had taken? This unplanned love that had grown in the shadow of loss? "Perhaps you're right," she said finally. "I hope you are." Morning brought news from the sheriff. Hodge had been captured trying to cross the county line, 3 of his men with him. The others had scattered, likely never to return. Hodge would face charges of kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder, enough to see him imprisoned for many years, if not hanged. "What about the land?" Ruth asked when the sheriff visited to take their statements. "The oil or gas beneath it?" Sheriff Taylor nodded. "I've sent those water samples to an expert in Topeka. Should have confirmation soon. If it's what we think, that land of yours could change everything for this county." The implications were enormous. Oil meant wealth development opportunity, not just for Ruth and Nathaniel, but for the entire region. Thomas's final gift might prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. By mid-morning, Dr. Bennet declared Nathaniel stable enough to be moved. He would need weeks of recovery, careful tending to prevent infection, but the prognosis was good. With the sheriff's help, they arranged transportation back to the Hayes Ranch, where Ruth could care for him properly. As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Ruth aside. "I'll come stay with you for a while," she offered, "to help with his care, and yours." Ruth squeezed the older woman's hand gratefully. "Thank you for everything." The journey home was slow and careful, every bump in the road drawing a tightly controlled grimace from Nathaniel, despite the laudanum Dr. Bennet had administered before their departure. By the time they reached the ranch, he was pale with pain and exhaustion, barely conscious, as the sheriff and Miller, his arm in a sling, helped him to bed. "Rest now," Ruth told him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Just rest." For the next week, Ruth barely left Nathaniel's side. With Martha's help, she tended his wound, changing bandages, bathing away fever, coaxing him to eat when his appetite waned. Their roles had reversed. She was now the caretaker, he the vulnerable one, dependent on her strength. During his lucid periods they talked about the land and what it might mean for their future, about Hodge now safely behind bars awaiting trial, about Thomas, whose final act had been to secure a legacy neither of them had anticipated. "He must have known," Nathaniel said one evening as Ruth changed his bandage, "about the oil. That's why he bought the land when he did." "But how?" Ruth wondered. "And why didn't he tell me?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe he wanted to surprise you. Or maybe he was waiting for confirmation before sharing the news." Ruth considered this. It sounded like Thomas, careful, methodical, not one to raise hopes prematurely. "I wish he'd had the chance to tell me himself." "I know." Nathaniel's good hand found hers, squeezed gently. "I'm sorry, Ruth, for everything you've lost." She looked at him, then really looked, at the man who had rescued her from the market, who had taught her to live again after tragedy, who had risked his life to protect her and those she cared about. "I've lost," she agreed softly, "but I've also found." As spring deepened toward summer, Nathaniel's strength returned gradually. The confirmation arrived from Topeka. The land indeed contained significant oil deposits valuable beyond their wildest expectations. Offers from drilling companies began to arrive, promising wealth that would secure their future and transform the county. Ruth found the prospect both exciting and overwhelming. Money had been scarce since Thomas's death, survival her primary concern. The idea of wealth, of unlimited possibilities, was almost too much to comprehend. "We don't have to decide immediately," Nathaniel assured her as they sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. "The land isn't going anywhere. The oil will wait." Ruth nodded, grateful for his steady perspective. "What would you do?" she asked. If the decision were yours alone, Nathaniel considered the question carefully, as he did all things. "I'd proceed cautiously," he said finally. "Allow limited drilling, retain ownership of the land and mineral rights. Use the income to secure our future, but not let it change who we are or how we live." Our future. The words settled in Ruth's heart, a promise and a question. Despite their legal marriage, despite the growing closeness between them, neither had spoken openly of love, of a true union beyond the arrangement that had begun as protection against Hodge. "And how do we live, Nathaniel?" she asked softly. "What are we to each other truly?" He turned to her, his eyes serious in the fading light. "What do you want us to be?" "Ruth." The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Ruth thought of the letters she had read, of Nathaniel's unspoken feelings for her, of her own heart's slow but steady turn toward this quiet, honorable man. "I want—" She hesitated, then found her courage. "I want a real marriage. Not just in name, not just for protection or propriety. I want to be your wife in every sense." Nathaniel's breath caught audibly. "Ruth," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I never expected, never dared hope." "I know," she said gently. "You've been so careful, so respectful of my grief, of Thomas's memory." She reached for his hand, twined her fingers with his. "But life goes on, Nathaniel. The heart heals and grows and loves again. I've learned that from you." "Are you certain?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. "I need you to be certain, Ruth, because I've loved you since that day at the market, when you sat straight-backed and proud, despite everything Hodge had done to break you." The confession, so simply stated, after months of careful restraint, brought tears to Ruth's eyes. "I'm certain," she whispered. "I love you, Nathaniel Hayes, not instead of Thomas, not in place of what we had, but newly, differently, wholly. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her heart ache. "Then I am the most fortunate of men," he said, "to be loved by you." That night, for the first time since their marriage, Ruth did not sleep in her separate room. Nathaniel carried her to his bed, their bed now, his strength fully returned after weeks of healing. There they discovered each other anew, not as caretaker and patient, not as protector and protected, but as husband and wife equal in need and giving. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window, Ruth lay in the circle of Nathaniel's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. A strange sensation in her legs drew her attention. A tingling, almost like the pins and needles of circulation returning after numbness. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice hushed with wonder. "I can feel something in my legs." He stilled, then propped himself up to look at her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "What do you feel tingling, like when your foot falls asleep and then wakes up?" She focused intently on the sensation, trying to make her toes move. There, the faintest twitch. I think I moved my foot. Just a little." Nathaniel threw back the covers, examining her legs with a doctor's careful assessment. "Try again," he encouraged. "Just your toes." Ruth concentrated, willing her body to obey. Slowly, painfully, her right toes curled slightly, then released. "My God!" Nathaniel breathed, his face alight with wonder. "Ruth, that's movement. Deliberate movement." Tears filled her eyes, hope almost too painful to bear after so many months of resignation. "Does it mean—" "It means the damage may not be permanent," Nathaniel said, his medical training tempering his excitement with caution. "Nerve regeneration is possible, though rare. It would explain the tingling, sensation returning before motor control." "Will I walk again?" Ruth hardly dared ask the question. Nathaniel took her hands in his expression serious but hopeful. "I don't know. It could be minimal recovery, just some sensation and slight movement, or it could be more significant over time." He squeezed her hands gently. "But whatever happens, Ruth, we'll face it together. I promise you that." The possibility, however remote, of regaining even partial use of her legs was a gift Ruth had not allowed herself to hope for. After months of adapting to her disability, of learning to live fully, despite her limitations, the prospect of recovery was almost frightening in its enormity. "I've learned to be strong in this chair," she said softly, "to not define myself by what I've lost." "And that strength will remain whatever happens," Nathaniel assured her. "It's who you are, Ruth, not your circumstances." She nodded, settling back into his embrace, allowing the hope to blossom carefully, cautiously. "One day at a time," she murmured. "One day at a time," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Summer brought changes to the Hayes Ranch. With the first payments from a carefully negotiated drilling contract, they made improvements to the house and barn, hired additional hands, purchased new livestock. Ruth continued her therapy. Exercises Nathaniel designed to strengthen her legs, to encourage the faltering nerve connections to re-establish themselves. Progress was slow, frustrating, measured in the smallest increments. A toe that would wiggle on command. A knee that would bend slightly when supported. Sensation that gradually returned patchy but persistent, like land emerging from floodwaters. There were setbacks, days when pain replaced tingling, when muscles refused to respond, when Ruth felt the weight of disappointment crushing her newfound hope. On those days, Nathaniel's steadfast support was her anchor, neither dismissing her frustration nor allowing her to surrender to it. Remember how you got back on Pepper after falling? He would remind her. The same strength is in you now. Rest if you need to, but don't give up. By mid-July, Ruth could stand briefly with support, her legs trembling, but bearing her weight for precious seconds before weakness forced her back to the chair. It was far from walking far from the independence she had once taken for granted, but it was more than she had dared hope for in the dark days after the flood. Martha visited regularly, bringing news from town, helping with household tasks, becoming the friend and confidant Ruth had sorely needed. Under her guidance, Ruth joined the quilting circle again, her wheelchair no longer a barrier to participation in community life. Pastor Porter came too initially to check on Nathaniel's recovery, but increasingly as a friend. He brought books, engaged Nathaniel in theological discussions that often lasted well into the evening, and quietly rejoiced in the genuine marriage that had grown from pragmatic beginnings. "I've seen unions with far less promising starts blossom into deep love," he told Ruth during one visit. "The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed." Ruth, who had questioned her faith so bitterly after the flood, found herself drawn back to the comfort of belief. Not the simple, unquestioning faith of her youth, but something more complex, more resilient. A faith that acknowledged pain and loss, but found meaning beyond them. The Bible that Nathaniel had so carefully restored became a symbol of this renewed faith. Its pages, once swollen and stuck together, now lay flat, the words legible despite water stains. Like Ruth herself, it bore the marks of its ordeal, but remained whole, functional, valuable. In August, a letter arrived from the county prosecutor. Hodge had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary. His remaining assets had been seized to pay damages to those he had harmed. Martha Miller and the Hayes Ranch would all receive compensation. "It's over," Ruth said as she and Nathaniel sat on the porch that evening, the letter on the table between them. "Really over." Nathaniel nodded, his expression contemplative. "Justice of a sort, though nothing can restore what he took from you." "From us," Ruth corrected gently. "Thomas was your friend, too." He acknowledged this with a slight nod. "I still write to him sometimes," he admitted. "In my head, not on paper anymore. Telling him about you, about us, about the land." "What do you tell him?" Ruth asked, curious rather than pained by this confession. Nathaniel looked out over the prairie golden in the late summer light. "That you're the strongest person I've ever known. That I'm trying to be worthy of the trust he placed in me, of the love you've given me." He turned to her, his eyes reflective. "That I hope he understands." Ruth reached for his hand, their fingers twining together with the easy familiarity of true partnership. "He does," she said with quiet certainty. "Wherever he is, he understands." They sat in companionable silence as twilight softened the landscape, each lost in private thoughts, yet connected by touch, by shared experience, by the love that had grown between them despite, or perhaps because of, the trials they had faced together. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Kansas sky, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace. The flood had taken much from her, her husband, her home, the use of her legs, but it had also, in its terrible way, brought her to this place, this man, this life. Water that destroyed had also cleansed, had carved new channels through the landscape of her existence. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Ruth smiled, the expression coming easily now after months of practice. "I'm thinking about water," she said. "About how it changes everything it touches, destroys and creates, takes away and gives back." Nathaniel nodded, understanding, as he always did, the currents of her thoughts. Like the flood. Like the flood, she agreed. It nearly drowned me, but it also brought me to you, to this. She gestured to encompass the ranch, their home, the life they had built together. I never expected to be happy again, Nathaniel. Never thought I could love again, but here I am doing both. He raised their joined hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to her fingers. Here we both are, he said softly, beyond the dark waters. Later that night, as Ruth prepared for bed, their bed shared now in all ways, she paused at the window, looking out at the moon-silvered prairie. In the distance, the newly erected oil derrick stood like a promise of future prosperity, of security for generations to come. But the true wealth she knew lay closer to hand, in the love she had found with Nathaniel, in the community that had embraced her in her own resilience discovered through adversity. These were the treasures the flood had paradoxically brought to her shores, carried on the same cruel currents that had taken so much away. As she turned from the window, Ruth felt the now familiar tingling in her legs, the precursor to the exercises she and Nathaniel performed each night to strengthen her recovering muscles. Bracing herself against the bedpost, she stood carefully testing her weight on legs that trembled but held. One step, then another, slow, halting, but deliberate. A third step brought her to the edge of the bed, where she sank down breathless with effort, but exhilarated by achievement. Nathaniel entered, stopping in the doorway as he realized what he had just witnessed. "Ruth," he breathed, his face alight with wonder. "You walked." "3 steps," she confirmed, tears of joy mixing with exhaustion. "On my own." He crossed to her, knelt before her, his hands gentle on her knees. "The first of many," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But even if there were no more, if 3 steps were all you ever took, it would be enough. You are enough, Ruth, exactly as you are." Ruth cupped his beloved face in her hands, this man who had seen her value when others saw only brokenness, who had given her space to heal at her own pace, who had loved her through darkness into light. "As are you," she whispered. "Exactly as you are." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering on the roof like a benediction. But unlike the devastating flood that had altered the course of their lives, this rain brought only renewal, only growth, only life. Water, once their enemy, had become their ally in the journey forward. Together, they had survived the flood. Together, they would thrive in its aftermath. And in that certainty, Ruth found the greatest healing of all, the end.